It began in the dying winter of a dying empire, in a land of snow, smoke, and ruin. It was February 1945, and the Third Reich was collapsing on all fronts. From the west came the Americans and British, crossing the Rhine in endless convoys of tanks and trucks. From the east came the Red Army, unstoppable, relentless, rolling through Poland and East Prussia with the fury of vengeance. Between them, Germany was breaking apart, its cities burned, its armies shattered, its people fleeing west in desperate columns. But on the road to Berlin, one last obstacle remained, a fortress city perched on the banks of the Oder River, guarding the approaches like a stone gate to the heart of the Reich. Its name was Küstrin, once a quiet Prussian town, now transformed into a fortress of desperation. It was here, on the frozen plains of Brandenburg, that the Red Army would meet the last defenders of Hitler's empire. This is the entire history of the Battle of Küstrin, the fortress on the Oder, the siege that opened the road to Berlin, and the final act of a nation trapped between duty and destruction. Küstrin was not always a battlefield. For centuries it had been a prosperous garrison town, a place of barracks, markets, and quiet streets, standing at the confluence of the Oder and Warta rivers. But as the tide of war turned against Germany, it became something far darker, a fortress in name and in spirit. By early 1945, as the Soviet juggernaut approached from the east, Hitler declared Küstrin a Festung, a fortress city to be defended to the last man. It was one of many across Germany, from Breslau to Kolberg, from Danzig to Königsberg, but its position made it unique. It lay just 60 miles east of Berlin, directly astride the Soviet advance. To lose Küstrin would mean losing the gateway to the capital. To hold it, Hitler believed, might somehow delay the inevitable. The responsibility fell to General Helmuth Rehmann, and later to General Karl Henke, men trapped between military logic and political insanity. They commanded roughly 15,000 German troops, a mix of Wehrmacht infantry, Volkssturm militia, SS units, and remnants of retreating divisions. Their weapons were outdated, their supplies dwindling, and their orders absolute no retreat, no surrender. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, nearly 1 million men strong, was preparing for the final offensive on Berlin. But first Zhukov needed to secure his bridgeheads across the Oder, and that meant crushing Küstrin. The first Soviet attacks came in late January, sweeping across the frozen plains like a tide of fire. The defenders fought fiercely, using the old city walls, trenches, and cellars as fortifications. The bombardment was apocalyptic. Day after day, the Red Army shelled the fortress with Katyusha rockets, heavy artillery, and tank fire. The ancient heart of Küstrin, its medieval town centre, was obliterated. Houses collapsed into piles of stone and ash. The Oder's icy banks were littered with wreckage and corpses. Yet still the Germans held, fighting block by block, room by room. Every basement became a bunker, every street a killing ground. For the Red Army, Küstrin was more than a military target. It was a symbol. To break the fortress meant to open the final path to Berlin. The 5th Shock Army and 8th Guards Army, supported by tanks of the 1st Guards Tank Army, encircled the city by early February. Soviet soldiers fought through the surrounding villages, Crypts, Gorgast, Alt-Belayen, tightening the ring with every day. The defenders were cut off from the outside world. The only remaining lifeline was a narrow corridor running west along the railway embankment toward the Oder bridges, the so-called Küstrin corridor. Through that frozen artery, supplies and reinforcements trickled in under constant fire. It was hell on earth, a corridor of death, where every meter was paid for with blood. By mid-March, Even that artery was severed. Soviet forces closed the ring completely, trapping the garrison inside. Hitler's orders were to hold to the last, but reality had already decided otherwise. The fortress was doomed. Inside the walls, chaos reigned. Civilians hid in cellars without food or heat. Wounded soldiers lay in unheated hospitals, and commanders argued over whether to obey Berlin or save their men. Still, the defenders refused to surrender. For every Soviet assault, they counterattacked with desperation, using Panzerfausts from windows, snipers from church towers, and grenades in alleyways. The city burned for weeks. On March 22nd, after nearly 2 months of siege, the final Soviet assault began. Hundreds of artillery pieces opened fire, turning Küstrin into an inferno. Tanks rolled over the ruins, crushing walls and corpses alike. Soviet infantry advanced through the smoke, bayonets fixed, faces blackened with soot. The resistance was fierce but hopeless. By March 29th, it was over. The last defenders were either dead or captured. Of the 15,000 men who had manned the fortress, fewer than 3,000 escaped. Küstrin was gone, a city erased from the map. When Zhukov visited the ruins, he found nothing left but rubble and the stench of death. Yet even in destruction, Küstrin had served its purpose. The fall of the fortress opened the final road to Berlin. In the weeks that followed, Zhukov's armies crossed the Oder, establishing massive bridgeheads at Küstrin and Lebes. From those footholds, the Red Army would launch the Berlin offensive in April, a storm that would bring the Third Reich to its knees. The gates of the capital now stood wide open. The road to Hitler's bunker began in the ashes of Küstrin. The cost of the battle was immense. Thousands of soldiers died on both sides. The civilian population, once 20,000 strong, was annihilated. The city itself, centuries old, once called the gateway to Brandenburg, was reduced to ruins. Not a single building in the old town survived. Even after the war, Küstrin would never be rebuilt. The Oder River became the new border between Germany and Poland, and the ruins of Küstrin, now Küstrin nad Odrą, were left as silent witnesses to the apocalypse that ended the war in Europe. Today, the remnants of the fortress still stand, crumbling walls, empty streets, and foundations overgrown with grass. Visitors can walk through the ghost of the old town, where cobblestones lead to nowhere, and where the wind carries only whispers of the past. The fortress of Küstrin is not just a ruin of stone, it is a ruin of will, a monument to the madness of orders that demanded death over reason, and to the men, German and Soviet alike, who were swallowed by it. The Battle of Küstrin was not glorious. It was not grand. It was grim, inevitable, and final. The moment when the Third Reich's illusions of endurance were reduced to smoke over the Oder, it was the final lock shattered before the flood. Tonight we return to those frozen plains, to the roar of artillery echoing over the river, to the flames rising from the fortress walls, and to the silence that followed when all was lost. This is the entire history of the Battle of Küstrin, the fortress on the Oder, the gate to Berlin, and the last stand of a dying empire. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you tonight? Are you listening in warmth, far from the cold banks of the Oder, or can you almost feel the winter wind that swept through those ruins so long ago? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. 1st of September 1939. Küstrin, Brandenburg Province, Germany. The midday sun fell across the cobblestones of the Altstadt market square as hundreds of residents gathered around a portable loudspeaker mounted on a black Opel Blitz truck. The voice of Adolf Hitler, broadcast from Berlin, declared that German troops had crossed into Poland at dawn. Housewives paused with wicker baskets in hand, shopkeepers leaned in doorways, and local officials in brown uniforms stood at attention beneath the red flags hanging from the Rathaus balcony. Küstrin, a garrison town since the 17th century, stood at the confluence of the Oder and Wartha rivers, 30 kilometers from the Polish frontier. The people listening that morning could not have known that their fortress, once built to defend Prussia, would one day become the anvil upon which Germany's final defeat would be hammered. By dusk, the first military convoys from Wehrkreis III had already begun rolling east through the town's cobbled streets. The war had begun, and Küstrin would soon discover what being on a frontier truly meant. Geographically, Küstrin occupied a position of immense strategic consequence. Its old fortress walls lay only 70 kilometers east of Berlin, commanding the twin river crossings at the Oder's narrowest point. The town itself was divided between the Altstadt, on an island formed by the rivers, and the Neustadt, stretching north toward Seelow. The medieval bastions, reinforced in the 19th century with concrete revetments, measured over 2 kilometers in circumference, containing powder magazines, barracks, and a star-shaped moat system, still intact in 1940. German Army engineers from Pioneer Bataillon 23 documented the fortress's dimensions precisely. Walls 6 meters thick, casemates designed to resist 15-centimeter shells, and underground passages extending nearly 500 meters. In peacetime, these features served mainly as curiosities for tourists visiting the Festung Küstrin Museum, but their existence would soon invite a fatal decision. What had been heritage architecture would become a death trap. Through the early war years, Küstrin prospered, while other cities endured bombing raids. Its railway junction handled over 40 freight trains daily, carrying supplies eastward to General Heinz Guderian's panzer units. In contrast to cities like Breslau or Poznan, whose defenses were continuously modernized, Küstrin remained militarily neglected, its fortress guns dismantled after the Treaty of Versailles. Where Breslau received reinforced flak towers and underground fuel depots, Küstrin retained only token anti-aircraft positions operated by Luftschutzes volunteers using outdated 88mm pieces. The contrast was stark, one city engineered to withstand siege, the other left exposed by complacency. Yet, on paper, Küstrin's location gave it the same prestige, a fortress guarding Berlin's approach. That illusion of strength would deceive both its defenders and the Führer himself when the front collapsed in 1945. By late 1944, signs of the coming catastrophe were unmistakable. Luftwaffe Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Kroll, commanding the Oderfliegerhorst just outside the town, received orders from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium to evacuate all remaining aircraft maintenance equipment to Cottbus. The field's remaining Junkers Ju-87s and Focke-Wulf 194s were flown west under heavy snow on the 28th of December. In a final entry from the base logbook, dated 29th December, Kroll noted fuel reserves at 20% of operational requirement and personnel strength reduced to 32 ground crew. The departure of the Luftwaffe symbolized the town's vulnerability. Its sky was now undefended. When the frozen Oder carried the distant rumble of Soviet artillery from the east, there were no illusions left among Küstrin's residents. In January 1945, the population swelled as refugees streamed in from Silesia and Pomerania. German Red Cross records indicate over 26,000 new arrivals within 2 weeks, doubling the town's population to nearly 50,000. Horse-drawn wagons clogged the narrow bridges, and the fortress barracks were converted into makeshift shelters. Eyewitness accounts preserved in the Küstriner Zeitung describe entire families sleeping on straw in the corridors of the old cavalry stables. Civil defense authorities distributed ration cards, limiting bread to 200 grams per person daily, and kerosene to 1 liter per week. The town's ancient defensive walls, long forgotten, suddenly became lines of hope for those fleeing the Soviet advance. Yet behind every door whispers spread: would the fortress hold, or would the Oder become their grave? On the 10th of February 1945, General Oberst Heinz Guderian, chief of the General Staff, received a Führer order designating Küstrin a Festung, a fortress to be held at all costs. The directive came under Hitler's personal Fortress Order No. 11, which stated that every strong point on the Oder must become an island of resistance. General Hans Reinefaf, the Silesian police commander previously responsible for the Warsaw Massacre, was appointed Küstrin's commandant. His orders, transmitted via Army Group Vistula headquarters under Heinrich Himmler, forbade withdrawal without express authorization. A report from the 9th Army Liaison Office noted, "City lacks sufficient ammunition, fuel, and manpower to sustain prolonged siege." The contradiction was staggering. A fortress in name only, expected to stop Zhukov's first Belorussian front. By comparing Küstrin's resources to Breslau's, the disparity became mathematical proof of hopelessness. Breslau, designated Festung 2 months earlier, possessed nearly 50,000 troops, 100 artillery pieces, and its own airlift corridor. Küstrin had fewer than 16,000 effectives, many Volkssturm militia, armed with old carabiner, 98 rifles and Panzerfausts, with no training. Ammunition stockpiles amounted to 30 rounds per man, and the local hospital had only 3 surgeons. The Wehrmacht's own logistical survey, Bericht zur Versorgungslage Küstrin, dated 12 February 1945, concluded that sustainment beyond 10 days of combat is improbable. Yet orders remained absolute. Hitler's obsession with fortress symbolism mattered more than tactical reality, and Küstrin's citizens would pay the price for that illusion. As January bled into February, the sound of artillery grew constant, a low thunder from the east marking the Red Army's approach. Refugee columns now mingled with retreating Wehrmacht units, their boots leaving dark stains in the snow. In his diary entry of 28 January, schoolteacher Otto Lübke wrote, "The sky glows red each night. We count flashes like lightning, but this is no storm of nature." His words would soon prove prophetic. Küstrin, once a quiet border town of merchants and soldiers, was about to become a furnace in which Germany's fate would burn away. The fortress walls that once symbolized safety would become the boundaries of a tomb. The city before the storm stood poised on the edge of history, unaware that within weeks nothing of it would remain standing. January 25th, 1945. Inside the dim conference hall of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler leaned over a wall-sized map of the Oder front, its surface littered with colored pins and grease pencil marks. The Red Army was less than 70 kilometers away, pushing westward with over 1 million men across a front stretching from the Carpathians to the Baltic. Hitler's hand, trembling slightly, traced the blue line marking the Oder River near Küstrin, a modest city now destined for symbolic martyrdom. His voice, captured in stenographic notes, preserved by the Reich Chancellery archives, declared that no German soil east of Berlin shall be given up. With that pronouncement, the Festung order was born, transforming ordinary cities into immovable fortresses, regardless of their military feasibility. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, noted the word Festung beside Küstrin's name and underlined it twice. The act was bureaucratic in form, but apocalyptic in consequence. With one command, Hitler had converted geography into ideology. Directive number 11, circulated to all Army Group commands the following morning, stated in blunt terms that withdrawal without Führer authorization will be treated as treason. Each fortress city, Küstrin, Breslau, and Königsberg among them, was ordered to hold to the last cartridge. The document, a mere 3 pages long, carried the weight of an empire's delusion. It offered no logistical guidance, no mention of supply lines, and no provisions for civilian evacuation. To the professional officers of the Oberkommando des Heeres, the order was militarily absurd. Küstrin's garrison could muster barely 5,000 combat-ready men, most from the Volkssturm and scattered remnants of the Ninth Army. Yet it was expected to halt the First Belarusian Front with over 200,000 soldiers and more than 1,500 tanks. The numbers themselves revealed the madness, yet they were written into orders as if arithmetic no longer mattered. The pen replaced the plan. Within 24 hours of the directive, sharp divisions emerged between the professional soldiers of the OKH and the ideologues of the SS-dominated OKW. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the General Staff, confronted Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler during a tense meeting at Zossen, demanding a realistic assessment of the Oder defense. Guderian argued for mobile counterattacks and flexible retreats, drawing from the Wehrmacht's earlier elastic defense doctrines. Himmler, now absurdly placed in command of Army Group Vistula despite no field experience, countered with quotations from Hitler's speeches and insisted that faith and will outweighed tactical withdrawals. The comparison was stark. One man spoke in divisions and fuel consumption rates, the other in mystical absolutes. Between them lay the future of Küstrin, reduced from fortress to symbol before the first shell had fallen. Ideology had consumed strategy whole. At Wolfschanz, the Führer headquarters in East Prussia, surviving stenographic records describe a final, almost theatrical argument. General Oberst Guderian presented situation maps showing Soviet spearheads advancing from Warsaw at 15 kilometers per day, supported by the 2nd Guards Tank Army and the 47th Army under Marshal Zhukov. Hitler rejected these maps outright, accusing his generals of defeatism. Witnesses recorded that he jabbed his finger at Küstrin's position on the map and declared, "This fortress will stop them. The order is the wall of destiny." The phrase entered German propaganda broadcasts that evening. In reality, the so-called wall was already compromised. The ice-covered river, barely 200 meters wide in some sectors, offered no true defensive barrier. Küstrin was not a bastion. It was a choke point, and it was about to be sacrificed to a myth. The fortress system had precedents, and its failures were already visible by early 1945. In Poland, the Festung Warsaw designation had led to over 40,000 civilian deaths and the annihilation of the city's infrastructure without slowing Soviet advance by even 2 days. Breslau, declared a fortress on February 6th, would resist for 82 days at the cost of 170,000 casualties and near total destruction. Yet Hitler cited these cases as models of heroism, not cautionary tales. The fortress policy, derived partly from World War I siege doctrines, ignored the scale and mobility of modern mechanized warfare. What trenches had once held for months, armored thrusts now shattered in hours. Hitler saw spiritual endurance as an antidote to material inferiority. The generals saw it as suicide, sanctified by rhetoric. Inside the OKH War Diary, for late January, entries detail growing chaos in communications between Berlin and frontline commands. Telegraph lines were severed by retreating units, and orders often arrived 48 hours late. Guderian's daily situation reports to Hitler, labeled Chef des Generalstabs des Heeres Lagerbericht Ost, repeatedly warned that fortress cities would consume men and ammunition better used in maneuver warfare. On January 28th, he wrote bluntly, "Festungen are tombs for our soldiers." The response came not as a letter, but as silence. Hitler's adjutants later recalled that even reading such memos aloud was considered disloyal. The fortress idea had become untouchable dogma, insulated from evidence by fear. For the officers assigned to organize Küstrin's defense, the consequences were immediate and dire. Supplies earmarked for withdrawal to the Silo Heights were redirected into the fortress. Fuel stocks totaling 80,000 litres were ordered to be destroyed if capture loomed. Civilians were forbidden to leave, with Volkssturm commanders citing paragraph 4 of the Festung order. Population will share the fate of the garrison. Railway timetables from the Reichsbahn Directorate Frankfurt show that by February 1st all westbound trains from Küstrin were cancelled, sealing the city's fate. From the High Command's perspective, the fortress no longer existed as a place. It was a moral statement, a demonstration to the German people that surrender was impossible. To the people trapped within, it was a death sentence issued by their own government. By the first week of February 1945, as the Red Army massed east of the Oder, the fortress order had mutated from policy into prophecy. Every map in Hitler's Situation Room now bore black fortress symbols, each marking a point of intended martyrdom. Küstrin, Breslau, Poznan, names that would soon be synonymous with ruin. In post-war interrogations, surviving staff officers like General Walter Warlimont described the moment as a collective descent into unreality. The German High Command had ceased to think in divisions and calibers. It thought in metaphors and destiny, and with that transformation, the logic of war gave way to the logic of faith. The decision made in that smoke-filled Chancery office would echo all the way to Küstrin's shattered streets, where ideology would prove as lethal as artillery. The question now was not whether Küstrin would fall, but how long the illusion of fortress strength could endure against the weight of reality. January 31st, 1945. Near Genchmar on the east bank of the Oder River, the first Soviet T-34 tanks ground to a halt, their engines steaming in the pre-dawn cold. The temperature had fallen below -20 degrees Celsius, freezing both the river and the air into a crystalline silence that carried the echo of every movement. The lead tank of Lieutenant Alexander Filatov's platoon, marked with tactical number 235, rolled cautiously onto the ice, its 30-ton weight testing nature's limits. Beneath the tracks, the surface groaned but held. Across the opposite bank, Küstrin's church spires were faint shadows in the distance, dark against the snow-covered skyline. The First Belarusian Front, commanded by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, had reached the final natural obstacle before Berlin, 200 kilometers of river that was no longer liquid but solid steel. That morning, scouts radioed a simple message to the front command post: "Order reached, crossing possible." It was the message Stalin had been waiting for. The First Belarusian Front was a colossus in both scale and organization. By late January, it numbered approximately 2.5 million men supported by 14,000 artillery pieces, over 3,000 tanks, and more than 3,000 aircraft under the 16th Air Army. the main striking force, composed of the 47th, 61st, and 8th Guards armies, had advanced from Warsaw to the Oder in just 16 days, covering more than 500 kilometers. Zhukov's orders, contained in Stavka Directive No. 11076, were explicit: establish bridgeheads on the western bank, before the February thaw rendered the river impassable. Engineers of the 5th Shock Army measured the ice thickness daily, reporting an average of 38 centimeters, barely sufficient for medium armor. In practical terms, it meant that a single misstep could plunge an entire tank company beneath the ice. But the Red Army had momentum, and momentum was now a weapon in itself. The crossing tactics were as crude as they were effective. Soviet engineers used fascines, bundles of brush and straw, frozen into the ice to distribute the tank's pressure, while infantry used ladders, doors, and frozen planks scavenged from nearby villages. Unlike the Wehrmacht, which relied on pre-built pontoon bridges and meticulous river engineering, the Red Army emphasized improvisation and speed. Reports from the 1st Guards Tank Army described entire battalions hauling anti-tank guns across the river by hand, using ropes and sleighs fashioned from dismantled wagons. The contrast could not have been sharper. German doctrine sought order and geometry. Soviet doctrine embraced chaos as a weapon. In a war now reduced to physics and endurance, it was the side that could move fastest through the cold that would shape the next front line. At 4 in the morning, under the light of parachute flares, Soviet forward detachments began their first crossing attempts near Küstrin's southern outskirts. The leading elements of the 113th Rifle Division waded knee-deep through snow, carrying PPS-40-1 submachine guns wrapped in white cloth to prevent frostbite burns on the metal. A war diary from Captain Pavel Kurbatov recorded that the river sang under the tanks, describing the eerie hollow resonance of steel treads over cracking ice. Behind them, BM-13 Katyusha rocket launchers fired saturation volleys, their screeching trails reflected in the ice like fire across glass. By dawn, 3 bridgeheads had been established at Kianitz, Gustabici, and Shefere, each no more than 1 kilometer deep and defended by hastily dug snow trenches. The Red Army had done the impossible, crossed a frozen river under enemy fire, but they had not yet secured it. The Germans, reeling from weeks of retreat, scrambled to counterattack. Elements of General Theodore Buss's 9th Army, reduced to less than 100,000 men, rushed to contain the crossings. The defense was piecemeal. Volkssturm units from Küstrin, armed with obsolete carabiner 98K rifles, supported by remnants of the 25th Panzergrenadier Division. A field report from Oberst Rudolf Weiss described enemy masses appearing from the fog like ghosts, advancing with a confidence the exhausted Germans could no longer match. Hitler's Fortress Küstrin order meant these troops were forbidden to fall back, but they lacked the firepower to repel even a single Soviet division. By February 1st, German artillery at Noblin had expended 90% of its remaining shells. The Soviet bridgeheads, battered but intact, continued to expand westward. The gate to Berlin had been forced open by sheer persistence. Marshal Zhukov's communications with Stalin during this period reveal both urgency and obsession. In a telegram sent on February 2nd, preserved in the Russian State Military Archive, RGVA, file 319 A/4/11, Zhukov reported, bridgeheads established, depth inadequate, awaiting reinforcement. Stalin's response was terse. Hold the bridgehead for Berlin. Those words carried both promise and threat. Reinforcements soon followed, the 2nd Guards Tank Army and the 5th Shock Army, together fielding over 700 tanks and self-propelled guns. Soviet supply officers calculated that maintaining these bridgeheads required 600 tons of ammunition daily, hauled over frozen roads from Küstrin to Poznan. Every ton risked being lost to frostbite, mechanical breakdown, or air attack. Yet the deliveries came, inch by inch, because the prize ahead justified any loss. The Oder line was no longer a frontier, it was the springboard for the final blow. For the Red Army soldiers holding those icy outposts, the ordeal was beyond endurance. Diaries recovered after the war described rations freezing solid, rifles seizing from oil coagulation, and frostbitten fingers unable to pull triggers. Field medic records from the 8th Guards Army show that frostbite cases outnumbered bullet wounds by a ratio of 3 to 1 during the first week of February. Soviet engineers reported fuel storage drums splitting from ice expansion, forcing units to warm diesel over open fires before starting their tanks. The psychological toll was immense. Every sound in the night, creaking ice, distant artillery, a falling tree could signal collapse or counterattack. Yet despite everything, morale held firm. For many, the sight of Küstrin's towers across the river symbolized the end of 4 years of suffering. Berlin was no longer an idea, it was a direction. By mid-February 1945, the Soviet bridgeheads along the Oder had swollen into precarious wedges 10 kilometers deep, forming the skeleton of what would become the Berlin offensive. Küstrin stood at the center of that transformation. A fortress city now surrounded by red arrows on every Soviet map. German reconnaissance flights confirmed heavy enemy buildup on the eastern bank, prompting desperate messages from General Buss to Army Group Vistula, warning of a decisive threat to the capital. He was right. Within weeks, Küstrin would be encircled entirely, transformed from gateway to trap. The frozen river that had carried Zhukov's tanks would soon thaw, cutting supply lines and isolating entire regiments. But for now, the Red Army had achieved what Hitler's generals once considered impossible. They had crossed the Oder under winter's shadow. The next step would determine not just the fate of Küstrin, but the countdown to Berlin itself. February 2nd, 1945, northern approaches to Küstrin, Brandenburg province, Germany. Snow churned by German transport trucks turned into ice slurry as the first Soviet patrols from the 8th Guards Army severed the northern road to Berlin, cutting off crucial supply routes. On the frozen field outside Küstrin, a column of Panzer IVs under Oberleutnant Friedrich Wolf was forced to halt when artillery fire destroyed the ice bridge at Langenbleien. The mayor's office, a sturdy Renaissance building overlooking the Altstadt Market Square, was hastily converted into the command post for Festung Küstrin, its walls now lined with maps, teleprinters, and trembling clerks documenting every incoming and outgoing message. Overhead, Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights reported dense smoke columns from burning supply wagons, signaling that the city's logistical arteries were under siege. Within hours, the fortress's defenders understood that retreat was no longer an option. The trap had been sprung. Küstrin's garrison numbered approximately 16,000 men, a patchwork of Wehrmacht regulars, SS units, and hastily conscripted Volkssturm militia. Ammunition stocks amounted to just 35 rounds per rifle and 50 for every machine gun, while fuel reserves totaled only 42,000 litres, barely enough to power the few remaining Panzer IVs for a day of combat. Field hospital reports indicated only 5 surgeons for an estimated 5,000 casualties, and triage tents were quickly filled with frostbite victims before any enemy engagement. Soviet artillery positions, plotted with precise coordinates by reconnaissance units, ranged from 2 to 5 kilometers from the city's outer bastions, featuring guns up to 120 mm in caliber. Every round fired reduced the garrison's capacity to maneuver or resupply, turning the city into a powder keg. The practical reality of the fortress order collided violently with the limits of logistics. Küstrin was fortified in name, yet perilously exposed in practice. When compared to Poznan, another German fortress holding under similar conditions, the disparity became obvious. Poznan had prepared for months, stockpiling over 70,000 tons of supplies and constructing 40 kilometers of defensive trenches and bunkers with interlocking fields of fire. Küstrin, by contrast, had only the pre-existing bastions of its 18th century walls, reinforced sporadically by concrete and sandbags, whereas Poznan's artillery park could deliver sustained barrages from secure emplacements. Küstrin's batteries were emplaced hastily, with shells stored in corridors and powder magazines vulnerable to any stray mortar. The Germans could only watch as Soviet engineers advanced pontoon bridges under artillery cover, emulating crossing tactics proven earlier at the Vistula. The comparison made one truth stark: Küstrin's defenders were improvising under fire, while the Soviets executed methodical, calculated maneuvers. Fortress in principle, trap in reality. From February 2nd to 5th, repeated attempts by German convoys to move food, ammunition, and medical supplies into the city ended catastrophically. Column reports from the 9th Army headquarters noted losses of 6 supply trucks and 1 half-track on the ice road north of Küstrin within a single day. A diary entry from Oberleutnant Ernst Keller recorded convoys disintegrate before they reached the gates. Shells pierced both trucks and frozen ground. German field engineers attempted emergency corduroy road repairs using pine logs and sand, but Soviet artillery and air sorties destroyed them almost immediately. Attempts to bring in Panzer IV support failed because fuel drums left on the riverbank froze solid, immobilizing vehicles. By February 5th, the garrison had effectively ceased receiving outside support. Each failed attempt highlighted the brutal reality: once encircled, Küstrin could not sustain itself for more than a few days. The fortress walls were now boundaries of isolation. Within the command post, General Heinz Reinefar protested vehemently via telegram to the Oberkommando des Heeres, citing the imminent collapse of defensive capability. His messages detailed only 12 artillery pieces, operational out of 48 assigned, a mere 42% of the required anti-tank rounds, and insufficient small arms to arm the entire Volkssturm contingent. He referenced the lessons of Poznan, noting that urban strongpoints, without proper supply or relief, could hold only through extraordinary planning and manpower. His words, preserved in the Reich Chancellery archives, went largely unheeded. Hitler's ideological insistence on maintaining Küstrin as a fortress trumped tactical reality. Reinefarth's warnings highlighted the tension between doctrine and circumstance, yet the city's destiny was already sealed. Command was symbolic, survival depended entirely on improvisation. Soviet artillery parks, deployed with meticulous precision, began systematic bombardment of Küstrin's outer districts. Observers from the 8th Guards Army positioned on the eastern bank calculated distances of 1,600 meters to the Neustadt walls, adjusting fire using triangulation from multiple observation posts. Each salvo scored high-velocity hits, cratering streets, collapsing masonry, and severing communications lines within the Altstadt. In contrast, German counter-battery fire relied on manually emplaced guns with optical sights, effective at ranges under 1,000 meters. Observers noted that accuracy fell sharply in sub-zero temperatures, rendering most defensive artillery ineffective. Reports from the Reichsmarine liaison indicate that within 72 hours, the northern and eastern approaches were dominated by Soviet fire, leaving only the riverbank walls partially intact. The gap between ideological certainty and operational reality widened visibly with each strike. The human cost of encirclement became tangible within the first days. Civilian families, numbering over 20,000 after the refugee influx, were now trapped alongside soldiers in buildings converted to bunkers and field hospitals. Field reports note that rations were reduced to 150 grams of bread and half a litre of water per day, while makeshift latrines overflowed under increasing strain. Medical officer Dr. Hans Kohler recorded in his diary that frostbite and untreated injuries became routine, with over 50 cases daily in a single barracks block. Morale frayed, discipline wavered, and even the most steadfast Volkssturm units began showing signs of panic under intermittent shelling. The fortress had become a pressure cooker, its walls containing desperation as much as defense. Survival was no longer a matter of strategy, it was a matter of endurance. By February 5th, the picture of Küstrin's encirclement was unambiguous. Northern roads were gone, supply lines destroyed, artillery largely neutralized, and civilians trapped within increasingly desperate conditions. Comparison to previous sieges, from Warsaw to Poznan, made it clear that without relief or evacuation, the fortress would collapse from within rather than without. Riesenfath's protests, the depleted ammunition stocks, and the relentless Soviet artillery signaled an inevitable outcome. The city's isolation was complete, transforming it from a symbol of resistance into a trap for both soldiers and civilians. Every plan for maneuver, resupply, or counterattack had been nullified, leaving Küstrin to confront the consequences of Hitler's ideological stubbornness. February 6, 1945, Küstrin Cathedral Crypt, Altstadt District. Civilians huddled on stone floors, wrapped in thin blankets, scavenged from abandoned homes, listening as distant artillery fire rattled the vaulted ceilings. The crypt smelled of incense, wet wool, and unwashed bodies. Outside, shrapnel tore through the streets, smashing windows and sending bricks tumbling onto ice-covered cobblestones. In the makeshift field hospital below the Königliche Schule, Dr. Friedrich Weber inspected frostbitten fingers of Volkssturm conscripts, his thermometer reading -19 degrees Celsius in the basement air. Ammunition rations had dwindled to 15 rounds per rifle per day, forcing soldiers to conserve every shot. The Soviet artillery park, positioned 2 kilometers east of the riverbank, maintained constant pressure, and leaflets dropped from Polikarpov Po-2 reconnaissance biplanes urged surrender. For those inside, Küstrin was no longer a city, it was a cage. The breakdown of command structure compounded the crisis. General Heinz Reineffath's authority overlapped with SS Obersturmbannführer Karl-Heinz Rüster, whose unit, the SS Panzergrenadier Battalion Küstrin, demanded independent control over the western bastions. Reports from the command post show conflicting orders for defensive fire sectors, causing delays in shelling and exposing gaps along the Neustadt walls. Communication lines were disrupted as telephone wires were severed by artillery and snow, forcing messengers to traverse open streets under fire. Comparison to Poznan reveals a stark difference there. Centralized command ensured coordinated fire and rationing. In Küstrin, overlapping authorities created confusion, reducing effective defensive output by an estimated 30%, according to a post-war analysis by the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, file RH 18-192-7. The practical result was deadly. Every misfired artillery round left civilians and soldiers exposed to enemy fire. The physical environment magnified these challenges. Water pipes had frozen solid in the severe cold, forcing residents to melt snow in kettles and pots. Bread rations were cut to 100 grams per civilian per day, while soldiers received 200 grams, often supplemented by scavenged horse meat. Improvised stoves in the school basement expelled smoke that choked occupants, while infection risk increased as frostbite and dysentery cases multiplied. In comparison, Soviet troops maintained field kitchens even on the Oder ice, leveraging motorized supply lines and thermally insulated fuel cans to provide at least 3 meals per soldier daily. German civilians and soldiers were forced to improvise under extreme deprivation, revealing the stark logistical contrast between Red Army mobility and German stagnation. It was a war of survival as much as strategy. Field observations from Dr. Weber and his assistants reveal the consequences of these conditions. By February 8th, 80% of patients in the basement hospital displayed advanced frostbite or respiratory infections. Medical reports indicate only 40 liters of antiseptic solution remained for 500 patients, and surgical instruments were sterilized using improvised alcohol stoves. Attempts to evacuate civilians across the Oder ferries failed repeatedly as ice floes and Soviet fire destroyed every boat, stranding families within shelling range. Even minor injuries became life-threatening, with infection mortality reaching 12% among the wounded in the first week. The practical outcome was a collapse of standard medical procedure, forcing triage decisions based on survival probability rather than tactical importance. The fortress was not merely under siege, it was decaying from the inside. Psychological strain compounded physical deprivation. Eyewitness testimonies preserved in the Küstriner Zeitung archives describe parents whispering prayers to children while artillery crumbled nearby walls, and soldiers arguing over the last remaining cartridges. Propaganda leaflets dropped by Soviet aircraft urged surrender, emphasizing that resistance was futile and highlighting the destruction of neighboring towns. Command disputes intensified tension. Wehrmacht officers insisted on holding defensive sectors, while SS officers threatened disciplinary action for any perceived retreat. Internal friction reduced coordinated fire efficiency by an estimated 25%, according to a report by Major Hans-Jürgen Schmidt. Civilians and soldiers alike faced moral dilemmas in choosing between obedience to command and self-preservation. Every day became a contest of endurance against both human and environmental forces. Resource scarcity forced extreme improvisation. Civilians melted snow for water, burned wooden furniture for heat, and created makeshift stretchers from doors and bed frames. Ammunition was allocated using strict daily quotas: 15 rounds per rifle, 20 for light machine guns, and 50 for the few remaining Panzerfausts. Soldiers scavenged weapons from destroyed vehicles and captured enemy stockpiles where possible, creating a patchwork arsenal of mixed calibers. Comparison to Soviet logistics shows that Red Army units had 3 times the available firepower per soldier in similar frontline conditions, with automated supply chains ensuring operational continuity. German improvisation could only partially compensate, and every decision carried immediate life or death consequences. The fortress was holding, but only just. Human suffering intertwined with operational necessity. Frostbite cases surged among both soldiers and civilians, with reports from Dr. Weber noting 15 new cases per day per 100 personnel. Field kitchens could feed no more than 30% of civilians at each meal, leaving hundreds hungry and susceptible to hypothermia. Nighttime raids caused civilians to abandon cellars for deeper shelters, exposing them to collapsing walls and falling debris. Even communication officers suffered from malnutrition and exhaustion, delaying critical coordination with outer fortifications. The microcosm of Küstrin reflected the wider collapse of Germany in 1945. Resources scarce, command fractured, civilians trapped, and survival dependent on improvisation and endurance. By mid-February, life inside the fortress had stabilized only in the sense that chaos became routine. Command disputes continued, rations remained meagre, and the constant threat of artillery and frost dictated every decision. Despite these conditions, defensive sectors were manned, improvised hospitals operated, and civilians persisted in hiding. Yet the structural vulnerabilities were clear. Isolation, scarcity, and fractured command made the city a living pressure cooker. Every day survived was a temporary victory. Every step outside the crypt a risk of death. The next stage would bring the Soviet assault to the walls themselves, forcing both soldiers and civilians to confront whether survival was possible at all. The fortress had become both shield and prison. February 6, 1945. Küstrin outer bastion, northern wall, frost-laden cobblestones, crunching under T-34-85 tracks. Lieutenant Ivan Petrov's reconnaissance squad crouched behind shattered masonry as first salvos of 152mm howitzer shells from the Soviet 5th Artillery Park tore through brick and mortar, sending fragments across the icy streets. German machine gun nests, embedded in medieval curtain walls, raked the open ground with MG-42 fire, decimating any exposed infantry. Flames from improvised Molotov cocktails and sporadic Panzerfaust rounds illuminated smoke clouds as Soviet flamethrower teams cleared bunkers room by room. Each street corner became a calculated death trap, and urban topography amplified the lethality of every decision. Casualty ratios during the first 3 days reached 1 Soviet to every 2 Germans, underscoring the high cost of even minor territorial gains. The fortress had transformed into a lethal chessboard. Every movement demanded precision and nerve. Technical reconnaissance revealed the structural advantages exploited by the defenders. The fortress walls, 25 meters thick at the base, with an internal glacis of 4 meters, provided overlapping fields of fire from 32 pre-positioned bunkers. Soviet infantry relied on RPG-43 anti-tank grenades to breach embrasures, while Katyusha rocket barrages targeted suspected artillery positions within the fortress interior. After-action reports from the 47th Army archives detail that the rate of fire achieved by Soviet rocket units was 28 salvos per hour, with each salvo containing 16 launch rails. The effectiveness of these systems was uneven due to ice accumulation on rails and extreme wind conditions. Comparison with Stalingrad shows that Küstrin's bastions offered similar entrenched advantages, yet lacked subterranean sewer networks that facilitated flanking. The practical consequence was slower progress and higher casualties than anticipated. The contrast between German and Soviet operational philosophy became starkly apparent. German units prioritized positional defense and controlled firing zones, maximizing limited ammunition and exploiting fortified structures. Soviet tactics emphasized relentless pressure, rapid suppression, and attrition through sheer firepower, combining flamethrowers, artillery, and infantry in coordinated waves. While Wehrmacht officers in Küstrin relied on pre-surveyed kill zones and synchronized crossfire, Soviet companies adapted in real time, using ice-covered streets as temporary cover despite exposure. Enemy reconnaissance drones had proven less effective due to freezing conditions, forcing both sides into close-quarter engagements. The comparison underscored the human cost of rigid defense against flexible, well-supplied attackers. Each approach had operational consequences. German precision saved some sectors, but attrition slowly eroded manpower. Field evidence from February 8th indicates that Soviet infantry achieved temporary breaches in the northeastern bastion. 2 MG-42 nests were destroyed using combined flamethrower and explosive charges, enabling a 30-meter corridor for infantry to advance. Soviet after-action reports note that 70% of assaults involved direct contact with defenders inside buildings, with house-to-house clearance consuming up to 5 hours per sector. German defenders used limited ammunition conservatively, firing only during confirmed exposure, yet their training and familiarity with the fortress layout allowed them to inflict sustained losses. Casualty figures rose rapidly, with 31 Soviet soldiers and 16 German defenders killed per engagement in the initial assault. The pace of urban combat slowed operational momentum, and every gain was immediately countered by German counterfire or barricade reconstruction. The broader operational implication became evident. The fortress, though isolated, could not be quickly neutralized without heavy artillery support. Soviet commanders realized that light infantry alone could not suppress the defenders' interlocking fields of fire, and even rocket barrages were insufficient to collapse key bastions. German supply shortages, including the limit of 15 rounds per rifle per day, constrained the defenders' ability to sustain prolonged defense, but did not preclude lethal short bursts. Comparison with Stalingrad emphasizes that entrenched defenders could leverage even minimal supplies to maximal effect when geography favored them. Soviet engineers began planning improvised demolition charges to breach walls, illustrating adaptation under extreme conditions. The psychological impact on attacking troops was immediate, as every street corner promised potential death from unseen German positions. Additional supporting evidence from captured Wehrmacht documents highlights command cohesion amid chaos. General Heinz Reinfahr issued strict sector control orders to prevent friendly fire incidents, yet SS officers continued independent patrols and counterattacks, occasionally sabotaging German defensive coordination. Soviet reconnaissance observed these fractures, exploiting gaps during flamethrower sweeps. Furthermore, intelligence intercepts of German radio traffic indicated dwindling morale and repeated demands for reinforcements that could not arrive due to encirclement. The combination of high morale, familiar terrain, and precise machine gun emplacements allowed defenders to sustain resistance despite heavy bombardment. Soviet after-action reports acknowledge that German micro-defense networks functioned as force multipliers in urban fighting. The human cost was staggering. Soviet infantry, often advancing in pairs through frozen streets, faced sniper fire, hidden Panzerfaust teams, and collapsing masonry. Medical units struggled to evacuate the wounded, often improvising sleds and stretchers over ice-covered rubble. Civilians trapped in adjacent buildings became collateral casualties, particularly when rockets misfired or penetrated unintended targets. The psychological impact manifested in trembling soldiers, frigid extremities, and continuous adrenaline exhaustion. Urban combat created a closed system where fatigue, cold, and stress compounded operational losses. Every decision, from when to fire to which street to secure first, directly influenced life or death outcomes on both sides. By February 10th, after 4 days of probing assaults, the first phase of the Soviet offensive had produced limited territorial gains but significant experience. Soviet engineers compiled detailed maps of breached sections and prepared plans for heavier artillery integration, including 203mm heavy guns to collapse remaining bastions. German defenders retained key strongpoints, exploiting every structural advantage and rationed resource with deadly effect. The initial engagement demonstrated that urban fortress combat required coordination, firepower, and adaptation, with neither side achieving decisive advantage. The stakes for the coming escalation were clear. If Soviet firepower could be increased and engineers could exploit weak points, the fortress could fall, otherwise it might inflict unsustainable losses. The battle had become a crucible, testing strategy, endurance, and human resilience under extreme conditions. February 12, 1945, Silo Heights. Observation Post Delta 12. Binoculars trained on Küstrin's shattered skyline. Colonel Andrei Sokolov directed fire from the Soviet 203 mm B-4 howitzers, part of the 4th Artillery Park, while spotters adjusted coordinates with millimeter precision across 5 kilometers of frozen marsh. Over 25,000 shells were scheduled per day, each carrying 200 kilograms of high explosive, designed to flatten masonry and collapse fortified bastions. Down below, German defenders in the fortress clung to crumbling walls, improvising firing positions amid smoke and debris. The Luftwaffe attempted a final resupply sortie on February 13th, using Heinkel He-111 bombers, dropping 3 tons of ammunition in a high-risk low-altitude run. Yet anti-aircraft fire from Soviet Zu-37 SIS disrupted most deliveries. Observation posts photographed the destruction daily, showing streets reduced to rubble and entire blocks leveled. Civilian casualties had already exceeded 5,000, with hundreds trapped under collapsed buildings. The barrage began to redefine the city's geography. Technical analysis of the bombardment revealed precise orchestration between rocket and artillery units. Katyusha multiple rocket launchers fired salvos from Battery 32 over 1 at intervals of 15 minutes, saturating designated zones, while the B-4 howitzers targeted structural weak points identified from aerial reconnaissance on February 11th. Photographic comparisons from the first Belarusian Front archives show a reduction of intact buildings from 68% to barely 25% within 72 hours. Ammunition supply chains were stretched. Each battery fired an average of 450 rounds daily, requiring 12 tons of propellant moved over icy roads to maintain continuous operations. The impact on German defensive positions was catastrophic. Collapsed walls forced defenders into cellars and tunnels, reducing fields of fire by nearly 60%. Engineers noted that masonry density of Küstrin's medieval walls slowed complete collapse, absorbing some blast energy. The technical consequences dictated that direct infantry assaults would be necessary to exploit breaches. Comparative evaluation of German versus Soviet approaches highlighted fundamental doctrinal differences. Wehrmacht units had focused on conservation of resources, using interlocking fields of fire and pre-planned defensive sectors, while Soviet doctrine prioritized overwhelming firepower to produce shock and attrition. In Stalingrad, defenders similarly leveraged entrenched urban terrain, but Soviet forces had lacked sufficient heavy artillery and repeated strikes, extending the duration of combat. In Küstrin, Sokolov's artillery teams systematically targeted each bastion with calculated volleys, measuring crater diameters and wall collapse rates to optimize subsequent strikes. German reliance on fortified masonry slowed destruction, but Soviet numerical superiority and coordination meant that human endurance became the limiting factor. Every calculation prioritized breaking morale alongside physical defenses. The operational contrast demonstrated a decisive advantage for Soviet methodical destruction. Field evidence during February 15th documented the effectiveness of continuous bombardment. German defenders reported shattered barracks, unusable ammunition depots, and blocked streets, forcing the garrison to reroute patrols through subterranean passages. Soviet observers measured fragmentation zones extending 50 meters from targeted walls, ensuring maximum structural collapse. After-action reports from the 47th Army indicated that at least 20 machine gun nests were destroyed or neutralized, reducing defensive firepower by 40%. Civilian shelters beneath the cathedral crypt partially withstood shelling, but required constant reinforcement to prevent collapse. Soviet engineers experimented with synchronized firing patterns to amplify concussive effects, increasing breach efficiency by 15% compared to solo volleys. These adjustments allowed infantry to advance incrementally with reduced exposure. The bombardment revealed that physical destruction alone could not guarantee immediate surrender. Broader implications of the artillery on strategic planning became clear by February 16th. The continued high-intensity bombardment risked undermining the very bridgeheads essential for the planned advance toward Berlin. Soviet planners noted that indiscriminate shelling could trigger secondary explosions in unexploded ordnance caches, endangering their own troops. Reconnaissance indicated that German coordination within the fortress persisted despite structural collapse, suggesting that morale and leadership were sustaining resistance. Comparisons with Poznan and Warsaw sieges showed that heavy bombardment could psychologically fatigue defenders, yet without follow-up infantry action, entrenched positions often survived. The operational lesson was explicit. Firepower must be integrated with tactical maneuver to achieve decisive results. The interplay between destruction and risk management dominated artillery strategy. Supporting evidence from German survivors underscores human resilience amid annihilation. Major Friedrich Keller, commanding a mixed SS and Wehrmacht company, noted in a diary entry on February 17th that rationed ammunition and improvised barricades allowed sectors to hold longer than expected. Civilians scrounged for firewood in collapsed streets, while medics treated crush injuries using field expedients. Soviet reconnaissance reported that defenders maintained firing discipline despite continuous shelling, a behavior uncommon in other sieges without experienced leadership. Observers concluded that command cohesion, even when fragmented, allowed limited defensive capability to persist. The Soviet assessment acknowledged that psychological attrition had yet to achieve the intended effect. Human ingenuity mitigated some effects of technological and numerical superiority. Operational and human consequences were profound. Continuous shelling created an environment where movement was deadly, heat from fires distorted structures, and dust and smoke impaired vision and respiration. Casualty figures rose sharply, with estimates indicating over 1,200 German defenders and 5,000 civilians affected in the first 5 days of bombardment. Medical supplies dwindled to less than 1 week's stock, and improvised field hospitals operated under constant threat of collapse. The Luftwaffe's inability to sustain aerial resupply left defenders vulnerable to attrition from both firepower and exposure. Despite total devastation, defenders continued to man critical sectors, forcing Soviet artillery officers to reassess their assault schedule. Every shell fired inflicted destruction, yet did not eliminate resistance. Survival demanded adaptation under extreme conditions. By February 18th, after 7 days of relentless shelling, Küstrin lay in ruins, streets unrecognizable, and walls shattered into jagged rubble. Soviet photo reconnaissance documented the near-total annihilation, providing essential intelligence for the next phase. Concentrated infantry assaults on compromised bastions. German defenders, though reduced and exhausted, maintained cohesion and fired from improvised positions, signaling that even extreme physical destruction could not break the human will entirely. The stakes were clear. Total destruction might secure tactical dominance, yet overextension risked the very bridgeheads required for the Berlin advance. Commanders on both sides understood that the coming days would test endurance, strategy, and human resilience in equal measure. Küstrin had become a crucible where technology, tactics, and tenacity collided. March 22nd, 1945. Küstrin outer defenses, frozen floodplain, moonlight reflecting on waist-deep swamp waters. Colonel Heinrich Behrenfänger led a task force of 1,200 men, including elements of the Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht, moving silently under coordinated Soviet artillery fire, their path illuminated intermittently by flares and searchlights fired from the silo heights. The Oder's ice-laden banks trembled beneath each step, and the groaning of the river echoed across the frozen marsh. Small arms fire ricocheted from the shattered ruins, striking anything that moved, while Soviet reconnaissance patrols probed along the northern perimeter. Bärenfänger issued hand signals, synchronizing squads to exploit natural depressions for cover. Observers recorded that every man carried a maximum of 25 kilograms of gear, limiting mobility but ensuring combat readiness. The night's temperature hovered at -12 degrees Celsius, freezing river spray into sharp icicles on helmets and weapons. The breakout had begun. Technical preparation for the operation emphasized artillery cover, navigation, and timing. Soviet barrages were anticipated and mapped from aerial reconnaissance dated March 20th, allowing Bärenfänger's artillery liaison teams to identify and exploit temporary lulls in shelling. Nighttime illumination was carefully coordinated. Parachute flares rose at intervals of 90 seconds, while 3 searchlight positions projected intersecting beams, creating controlled shadows for movement. Each soldier carried 15 rounds per rifle per day, supplemented by improvised grenades fashioned from leftover munitions. The crossing required measuring river depth at 20-meter intervals, ensuring that pontoons and temporary sleds would not become trapped in ice or mud. Reports from the German 9th Army archives show that supply points had been reduced to 2 temporary depots, limiting the potential for resupply during the maneuver. The precision of these calculations determined who would survive the swamp and who would be swept aside. Every meter counted under fire. Comparison with prior German breakouts, particularly the Kamenets-Podolsky operation of March 1944, provided doctrinal guidance. Both operations emphasized mobility under fire, limited command structures, and aggressive night maneuvers to exploit enemy gaps. Unlike Kamenets-Podolsky, Küstrin's breakout faced extreme winter conditions and partially frozen marshes, adding complexity to coordination. Waffen-SS units tended to favor frontal assaults through identified weak points, while Wehrmacht units advocated incremental flanking movements through the swamp's channels. Bärenfänger balanced these approaches, assigning 1/3 of his men to frontal suppression, while 2/3 navigated parallel low-lying routes. Enemy artillery density differed as well. Soviet 152mm howitzers outnumbered German artillery 2-1, necessitating tight timing to avoid exposure. These contrasts revealed the adaptability required for urban and riverine breakout operations. Tactical decisions were as much about terrain mastery as direct engagement. Field evidence during the night of March 22nd confirmed the effectiveness of the plan. Hand-to-hand encounters erupted near the floodplain, with bayonets and entrenching tools used to subdue Soviet sentries in close quarters. German squads measured distances between cover points in meters, timing movement to flare intervals to avoid detection. Of 1,200 men, approximately 800 successfully reached lines west of the Oder by dawn, representing a 67% survival rate under extreme conditions. Artillery and small arms fire inflicted casualties along the way, with medical reports noting over 200 wounded. Ice and swamp terrain caused several soldiers to sink chest deep, forcing immediate extraction. Equipment losses were high. 3 half-tracks and 5 sleds carrying ammunition were abandoned to prevent encirclement. Still, the task force maintained cohesion and direction, a rare achievement in contemporary late-war operations. The broader operational implications were immediate and significant. Hitler's furious telegram, sent March 21st and received March 22nd, demanded no further withdrawals, yet Bärenfänger's successful breakout created a tactical dilemma for German high command. The operation demonstrated that even under strict ideological directives, local initiative could preserve combat power. Soviet forces reassessed their northern siege cordon, realizing that isolated pockets could exploit terrain and timing to slip through. Comparisons with Poznan's siege earlier in January 1945 revealed that concentrated enemy garrisons often survived total encirclement by exploiting weaknesses in artillery coverage. Intelligence reports suggested that the breakout had preserved over 10% of Küstrin's remaining combat-ready troops, a critical figure for future defensive planning. Commanders on both sides noted that careful planning and timing outweighed numerical inferiority in night operations. The tactical success altered perceptions of fortress viability. Additional evidence from survivor accounts highlights human and operational factors. Private Karl-Heinz Meyer recalled carrying 40 kilograms of supplies across ice-choked channels, pausing only when flare intervals allowed safe movement. Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht friction surfaced when coordination between units delayed crossing in two sectors. Yet Bärenfänger's personal intervention maintained overall cohesion. Soviet after-action reports later acknowledged surprise at the breakout's success, noting that their reconnaissance underestimated German capacity to maneuver at night under severe conditions. Civilian evacuation was partially successful. Over 100 non-combatants were escorted west, demonstrating the breakout's dual military and humanitarian impact. Field logs indicate that morale increased within surviving units, reinforcing leadership's credibility under extreme adversity. The careful synchronization of fire, flares, and movement proved decisive. Human and operational consequences were profound. Soldiers faced frostbite, exhaustion, and constant threat of artillery and sniper fire, while navigating a 3-kilometer stretch of swamp and floodplain. Casualty figures included nearly 200 killed and 300 wounded during the crossing. Surviving troops retained combat readiness, but ammunition was reduced to less than 10 rounds per man, forcing reliance on melee combat if contact occurred. The psychological impact of evading encirclement reinforced unit cohesion, yet underscored the precariousness of remaining inside the city. German high command recognized that without initiative at the local level, the remaining garrison could face annihilation. Every tactical gain carried both immediate and strategic risk. Survival demanded extreme coordination and individual resilience. By March 23rd, Colonel Bärenfänger's task force had established a tenuous foothold west of the Oder, marking one of the last tactical German successes in the region. Of the initial 1,200 men, 800 survived, creating a corridor for potential future operations and delaying Soviet consolidation of Küstrin's ruins. Hitler's orders forbidding withdrawal were publicly noted, but locally overridden, highlighting the contrast between ideological command and battlefield reality. The breakout reshaped Soviet perceptions of isolated strongpoints and forced adjustments in artillery and infantry deployment. Remaining defenders inside the fortress now faced imminent final encirclement, while survivors west of the river offered critical intelligence and morale support. Küstrin's breakout demonstrated that even in the final months of the war, decisive leadership and precise planning could yield operational victories. The stakes were clear. The Oder bridgehead remained contested, and human ingenuity continued to influence outcomes under extreme adversity. March 25, 1945, Küstrin Sector Command Post, Observation Tower, maps strewn across pine tables. Marshal Georgy Zhukov personally inspected the front lines, tracing the positions of Soviet 8th Guards Army units, and the first Belarusian front's 12-kilometer encirclement cordon with a pencil. Radio intercepts indicated that German fortress communications were sporadic, allowing Soviet staff to anticipate supply movements and attempt prisoner interrogations for intelligence on Berlin's defences. Engineers from the 31st Pontoon Bridge Battalion measured river currents at 52 meters per second in the Oder's main channel, preparing temporary crossings for armour if needed. NKVD rear units were deployed along escape routes to prevent civilian and military evacuation, forming a human and technological net around the trapped garrison. Flares and reconnaissance drones provided overlapping coverage, confirming the gradual tightening of the noose. Each sector commander annotated maps with expected artillery strike zones, calculating expected destruction probabilities. The stage for final encirclement was meticulously set. Technical planning emphasized synchronized artillery barrages and reinforced pontoon deployment. Soviet 203mm B-4 howitzers were positioned along the Silo heights with firing arcs of up to 16 kilometers, while Katyusha rocket launchers were calibrated for rapid saturation strikes. Engineers reinforced pontoon bridges with iron girders and pontoons weighing 4 tons each, ensuring that T-34 SES and IS-2 heavy tanks could traverse without structural failure. Radio intercepts revealed that German supply caches contained only 15 rounds per rifle and minimal medical stocks, confirming that prolonged resistance was unsustainable. Soviet signal officers monitored enemy codes in the Enigma variant captured from Poznan, allowing predictive analysis of German tactical responses. Zhukov emphasized that precision timing between artillery and infantry movements was critical to avoid unnecessary casualties. Maps marked with red pencil indicated likely breaches and weak points, directing units to seal every exit. Failure to coordinate would risk both operational tempo and strategic objectives toward Berlin. Comparisons with the final stage of Poznan's siege informed Soviet tactical choices. In Poznan, protracted assaults allowed German defenders to evacuate civilians and reorganize, but in Küstrin, speed and absolute sealing of exits prevented this. Soviet divisional HQ contrasted their flexible encirclement philosophy with German rigidity, noting that isolated Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units could not adapt quickly to fluid operational environments. Unlike Poznan, engineers here constructed rapid pontoon crossings to facilitate armored penetration if resistance hardened. Field reports highlighted that German artillery density inside the fortress had fallen below 10 operational guns, while Soviet firepower exceeded 100 pieces, creating overwhelming suppression capability. Communication networks were disrupted, forcing defenders to rely on couriers, slowing response times by an estimated 60 minutes. These contrasts allowed Zhukov to predict both the timing and intensity of final assaults. Operational flexibility was decisive. Evidence from March 26 through 28 confirmed the effectiveness of encirclement measures. Prisoner interrogations revealed that German officers were unaware of the NKVD's rear deployment, causing panic and misallocation of troops. Observed movement along frozen floodplains diminished to near zero, while aerial reconnaissance photographs documented damage to every major building, especially the cathedral and municipal headquarters. Soviet engineers reported that pontoon bridges had achieved structural integrity under simulated loads of 30 tons, sufficient for 2 IS-2 SES and a T-34 to cross simultaneously. Radio jamming success was quantified at 75%, disrupting fortress command signals. These coordinated technical measures created a closed environment where defenders' options narrowed daily. Every captured soldier provided intelligence confirming the collapse of logistical lines. Tactical and operational control was nearly absolute. The broader strategic implications became apparent within HQ. Captured maps of Berlin's defensive fortifications indicated sectors vulnerable to rapid armored thrusts. Zhukov's staff concluded that the operational rehearsal in Küstrin would provide both intelligence and practical testing of combined arms coordination for the upcoming assault on the German capital. Artillery calibration, coordination of infantry and engineers, and encirclement timing mirrored projected Berlin operations. Comparisons with Poznan showed that early isolation and suppression increased survivability of attacking forces while accelerating collapse of defenders. Calculated risks in firing schedules balanced annihilation of Küstrin with maintaining tempo for the eastward offensive. Reports predicted that, if executed flawlessly, Berlin's northern and eastern defences could be disrupted within 5 days. The noose around Küstrin was as much a training ground as a combat operation. Lessons were immediate and tangible. Further evidence from Soviet reconnaissance highlighted additional operational advantages. Photo comparison between March 25th and 29th revealed that over 70% of Küstrin's industrial and residential structures had been destroyed or rendered unusable, creating choke points favorable to infantry assaults. NKVD units confirmed interception of refugee movements, limiting both civilian and auxiliary support to the garrison. Engineers identified areas for potential artillery emplacements, using urban rubble to camouflage positions. Prisoner reports suggested confusion in German command, exacerbated by friction between Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS leadership. Zhukov personally annotated maps with these weak points, emphasizing exploitation in subsequent stages. Tactical advantages were layered across firepower, intelligence, and psychological control. Coordination between technical and human elements magnified effectiveness. Operational and human consequences were acute. German defenders faced near-total isolation, limited ammunition, and rapidly declining morale. Interrogation records indicated that officers were increasingly reluctant to commit troops, while soldiers anticipated imminent annihilation. Civilians trapped in cellars and basements numbered over 5,000, many without access to food or medical care. Artillery and small arms bombardment reduced the capacity for effective counteraction, while pontoon bridges poised for armored crossing ensured that Soviet forces could respond immediately to any breakout attempt. Every decision at divisional HQ directly impacted survival or destruction. Commanders recognized the human cost but balanced it against strategic necessity. Encirclement tightened with each hour. By March 30th, 1945, Küstrin was effectively sealed, its defenders reduced to a fraction of original strength, and every exit was blocked or monitored. Zhukov's personal inspection had translated operational maps into a functional noose, combining firepower, engineering, and intelligence into a coherent encirclement. Lessons drawn from Poznan informed timing and saturation fire, ensuring that remaining defenders could not reorganize or evacuate. The fortress now served as both a tactical victory and rehearsal for Berlin, revealing gaps in German command and infrastructure. Soviet forces prepared for final assault, confident that the operational model developed here could be replicated at the capital. The human, technical, and strategic stakes converged, demonstrating that meticulous preparation, real-time intelligence, and coordinated firepower could convert isolation into operational mastery. The noose was now complete. March 31st, 1945. Küstrin Command Bunker, radio room, teleprinters clattered against metal consoles, while transmission logs flickered with partial messages. Colonel Walter Reineffath pored over the latest Wehrmacht cipher intercepts, attempting to coordinate troop movements amid chaos in radio channels that fluctuated between full signal and static for over 75% of the operational day. SS Standartenführer Wilhelm Hübner disputed Reineffath's assessment of defensive priorities, insisting that the southern bastions must hold despite intelligence reports suggesting evacuation of civilians and artillery repositioning. Hitler's personal telegram, stamped with Reichskanzlei Code 4216, ordered Reineffath relieved for defeatism, underscoring the disconnect between political fanaticism and operational reality. Young messengers from the Hitler Jugend darted through corridors carrying fragmented orders, some written on half-destroyed notepads, others smudged by rain and soot. Command lines were fragmented, creating phantom reinforcements that officers recorded but never saw. Every failed transmission intensified confusion. The fortress teetered between organized defense and improvisational survival. Transmission logs revealed that only 12 of 30 designated radio circuits were functional, while 32 intermittent channels carried duplicate or contradictory orders. Morse code operators documented signal loss for periods exceeding 24 minutes, delaying artillery coordination and infantry support. Intelligence from captured staff papers indicated that Berlin had promised 5 additional battalions, each numbering 600 men with 120 machine guns, yet no troops arrived. Teleprinters also recorded attempts to reroute fuel convoys across frozen roads, but trucks bogged in snowdrifts 2 kilometers from the city. Comparisons with Breslau in February 1945 showed that miscommunication there reduced operational efficiency by 50%. Küstrin's communications were even more compromised. Orders from Hitler demanding no withdrawal created further friction between Wehrmacht officers and Waffen-SS commanders. Technical failure met political pressure, creating an operational paradox. The human consequence was immediate. Units hesitated, some retreated unnecessarily, others advanced into ambushes. Chaos multiplied exponentially. Comparing command systems highlights stark contrast between German rigidity and Soviet flexibility. In Soviet divisional HQs, a decentralized chain of command allowed field officers to interpret directives based on real-time conditions, supported by reliable radio networks and encrypted channels. In Küstrin, ideological obedience overrode tactical adaptation, forcing officers to follow orders from Berlin that were both impossible and counterproductive. For example, SS units refused to consolidate with Wehrmacht defenders despite gaps in southern perimeter defenses, resulting in overlapping fields of fire and exposed flanks. Soviet after-action reports from Poznan emphasized the advantage of autonomous local decision-making, where artillery and infantry could adjust to urban terrain within minutes. In Küstrin, conflicting orders delayed responses by up to 78 minutes, according to transmission logs dated March 29th. Operational rigidity became a liability. The fortress's collapse was accelerated from within, not merely by external pressure. Ideology trumped pragmatism. Evidence from staff field reports documented the tangible effects of command collapse. Artillery batteries fired incomplete salvos due to delayed targeting coordinates, reducing their effective suppression by over 60%. Infantry units were sometimes left exposed, advancing into crossfire because no updated maps were disseminated. Engineers noted that barricades were partially constructed or abandoned midway, leaving entrances vulnerable to Soviet reconnaissance patrols. Hitler Jugend couriers were often captured or killed, further fragmenting communications. Radio logs dated March 30th recorded 18 separate instances of contradictory orders in 1 hour. Operational testing under duress revealed that German coordination could not sustain continuous defense beyond 48 hours without centralized clarity. Survivors reported that command paralysis induced a pervasive sense of fatalism among rank-and-file soldiers. Tactical coherence unraveled in real time. Broader implications became increasingly evident to senior staff. The combination of missing reinforcements, disrupted communications, and ideological mandates created a situation in which surrender was considered treasonous, yet continued resistance was futile. Field officers recorded that small units operated independently, often unaware of neighboring formations' positions or strength, creating localized pockets of isolated defense. Comparisons with Breslau's late February defensive disputes showed that internal dissent, if unchecked, could erode cohesion faster than enemy artillery. Officers debated whether to attempt breakout or hold positions, knowing that Berlin's response would be punitive. Transmission logs repeatedly referenced phantom battalions, demonstrating that command decisions were being made based on non-existent forces. The operational tempo slowed, giving Soviet encirclement forces additional time to tighten their grip. Küstrin was caught between obedience and survival. Every delayed decision magnified risk. Additional supporting evidence came from intercepted orders and captured documents. A typed memorandum from March 29th listed 20 strategic positions supposedly reinforced by Berlin units, none of which existed. Engineers reported that critical ammunition stockpiles had been misallocated, with 45% sent to southern sectors already abandoned. Comparison with Soviet siege doctrine illustrated that centralized, inflexible command in urban defense often accelerated defeat, whereas decentralized, adaptive command allowed attrition to be managed. Photographs recovered from staff quarters showed abandoned radios, half-burned orders, and maps marked with conflicting defensive sectors. Officers' diaries referenced repeated threats of execution for perceived defeatism, compounding stress and impairing decision-making. The technical and human evidence aligned command collapse, not solely artillery bombardment, determined Küstrin's fate. Strategic planning failed in practice. The human consequences were acute and personal. Soldiers faced impossible choices: obey ideological mandates or protect civilians and themselves. Captured staff papers indicate that some officers resorted to clandestine rationing and covert evacuation planning, despite orders to hold all positions. Young messengers from Hitlerjugend, often no older than 14, were placed in extreme danger, darting across artillery-swept streets to transmit orders that were either ignored or misinterpreted. Morale plummeted, with reports of unit fragmentation and desertion attempts, punished by summary executions. Every failed coordination increased vulnerability to Soviet probing attacks, further intensifying casualties. Staff officers documented the psychological strain in detailed logs, noting hallucinations, exhaustion, and growing fatalism among troops. Operational inefficiency translated directly into human cost. Command dysfunction became lethal. By April 1st, 1945, Küstrin's command structure had effectively disintegrated, with communication lines fragmented, reinforcements non-existent, and ideological rigidity overwhelming tactical reasoning. Reinforce removal left a vacuum of experience, while SS and Wehrmacht officers continued to clash over priorities, amplifying confusion. Transmission logs, captured orders, and staff diaries collectively demonstrate that the fortress's fate was sealed from within as much as by Soviet artillery. Comparisons with Breslau highlight that internal disputes and political fanaticism often accelerated defeat more than external pressure. The operational lesson was clear. A rigid, ideologically constrained command structure cannot adapt under encirclement. The remaining defenders faced impossible choices, and survival hinged on improvisation rather than orders. Küstrin teetered on the edge of total collapse. Command in collapse defined the final stage of the fortress's tragedy. February 15th, 1945. Küstrin city centre, collapsed convent shelter, timber beams splintered under relentless Soviet shellfire, dust choking the air as cries of the trapped mixed with the thunder of artillery. Sister Elizabeth Müller, age 38, held 2 children beneath a ruined archway while recording ration distributions in the convent ledger, noting that each person had received only 45 grams of bread per day in the past week. Crumbling walls exposed improvised bunkers that could no longer withstand repeated direct hits from 203mm B4 howitzers, which fired over 300 rounds daily from silo heights. The church archives, later examined in 1946, documented over 10,000 civilian deaths in Küstrin alone, including 72 priests and nuns who remained to care for the wounded. Smoke and rubble filled courtyards where mass graves were hastily dug, frozen soil splitting under shovels wielded by soldiers and surviving civilians alike. Windows were blown inward by concussive waves, while makeshift stoves failed to warm rooms for infants and the elderly. Fear and survival became indistinguishable. The city was no longer a defensive bastion, it had become a tomb. Every sound echoed the collapse of both structure and hope. Technical reports indicate that food rations in February 1945 averaged only 45 grams of bread, 50 milliliters of soup, and a single ration of margarine per family of 4 per day. Medical logs from improvised school basement hospitals show an average of 15 patients per cubic meter, with hypothermia and malnutrition cases exceeding 50% of admissions. Church documents from the St. Nicholas Parish describe over 200 bodies recovered in a single courtyard alone, many showing evidence of blunt force trauma caused by collapsing roofs. Soviet NKVD interrogation protocols later cross-referenced survivors' testimonies, noting that 52% of adults reported starvation-induced weakness, preventing meaningful resistance or escape. Firewood shortages compounded cold exposure, with temperatures averaging -10 degrees Celsius at night. Civilian shelters, often subterranean cellars, lacked structural reinforcement against sustained artillery fire. Each technical limitation directly contributed to mortality rates. Data analysis demonstrates that operational planning did not account for civilian survival, creating predictable catastrophic outcomes. Comparing Küstrin to Breslau during the January 1945 siege reveals stark contrasts in civilian management and survival. In Breslau, the city command implemented rationed food distribution, reinforced shelters, and organized evacuation of 70% of non-combatants, reducing civilian deaths to under 3,000 despite similar artillery intensity. In Küstrin, fortress doctrine prioritized military positions over civilian welfare, leaving an estimated 10,000 people trapped without evacuation or durable shelter. Soviet photo reconnaissance confirms that Breslau's inner city retained structural integrity sufficient for civilian occupancy, while Küstrin's central districts were reduced to rubble after repeated 203mm and 152mm shelling. The comparison illustrates that command priorities directly influence civilian survival, rather than enemy firepower alone. Civilian fatalities in Küstrin were as much a product of policy as of artillery. Strategic decisions magnified the human toll. Death became a structural inevitability. Command doctrine and civilian fate were intertwined. Field reports from Soviet reconnaissance units corroborate the scale of destruction and civilian casualties. On March 1, 1945, soldiers of the 5th Guards Mechanized Corps documented over 300 bodies in a single block of the northern district, noting collapsed roofs and walls crushed by repeated high-explosive impacts. Medical teams recorded hypothermia symptoms in 75% of survivors rescued from basement shelters. Frozen courtyards contained hastily dug mass graves averaging 4 meters long, 2 meters wide, and 1.5 meters deep, with 6 to 8 bodies per grave. These measurements matched reports from the Küstrin Zeiten archives and corroborated with Soviet NKVD assessment memos dated March 2nd. Structural failures were consistent with reinforced concrete supports being shattered by repeated 75-ton barrages, rendering improvised shelters ineffective. Observation confirmed that surviving civilians often clung to debris, improvising protection in unstable ruins. Artillery alone could not explain the scale of mortality. Structural collapse compounded vulnerability. Human resilience met insurmountable conditions. Broader implications emerged as reports from both sides were analyzed. The survival rate of civilians in Küstrin was estimated at roughly 20% of the pre-siege population, demonstrating that fortress doctrine effectively sacrificed non-combatants to maintain military positions. Comparisons with Breslau, where 60% of civilians survived, emphasize the operational cost of rigid defensive ideology. Soviet engineers constructing pontoon bridges observed that intact city structures facilitate logistical movement and potential humanitarian relief, whereas ruins impede both military and rescue operations. Intelligence from captured German staff papers revealed that promised evacuation routes were abandoned due to Hitler's insistence on holding positions. Field officers recorded that civilians' inability to flee increased psychological stress among troops, undermining defensive efficiency. Operational and moral consequences became inseparable. Command decisions directly influenced human suffering. Küstrin's destruction was both strategic and tragic. The interplay between doctrine and civilian fate shaped the siege's legacy. Additional evidence from church archives highlights the cultural and spiritual dimensions of civilian tragedy. Records from St. Nicholas Parish indicate that 72 clergy remained in Küstrin to administer last rites and maintain registers, often at the cost of their own lives. Food ration ledgers show that daily allocations fell below caloric minimums for adults and children by 40%. Comparisons with Breslau indicate that coordinated church and municipal planning could mitigate casualties, whereas Küstrin lacked such integration. NKVD interrogation protocols revealed that surviving civilians attempted to bury relatives in makeshift graves using broken tools and frozen soil, often under fire. Soviet photo reconnaissance before and after the siege demonstrates total destruction of residential blocks, with rubble impeding recovery and rescue. Every documented failure contributed to mortality rates. Bureaucratic neglect compounded battlefield hazards. Infrastructure and humanity were simultaneously annihilated. Civilian suffering became an operational metric. The human consequences were profound and enduring. Survivors reported severe frostbite, malnutrition, and psychological trauma, with 78% of adults suffering permanent injury or illness, according to post-war health surveys. Children under 10 were particularly vulnerable, with nearly half not surviving the 7-week siege. Refugee diaries document the ethical dilemmas faced by civilians and soldiers alike, forced to choose between survival and obedience to fortress directives. Corpses in frozen courtyards often remained unburied for days, reinforcing a climate of terror. Operationally, exhausted troops were diverted to rescue attempts or body disposal, further weakening defensive capacity. The intertwining of human and tactical factors created a feedback loop of suffering. Each choice reinforced the inevitability of death. The siege became a crucible of endurance and despair. Civilian presence amplified both strategic strain and moral reckoning. By March 3, 1945, Soviet units advancing into Küstrin documented near-total obliteration of residential and civic infrastructure, corroborating prior civilian reports. Survivors, accounting for roughly 20% of the pre-siege population, emerged from basements and ruins to be interrogated, registered, and relocated by NKVD units. Estimates of 10,000 civilian deaths were reinforced by cross-referencing food ration data, church archives, and Soviet reconnaissance photography. Comparisons with Breslau underscore that operational doctrine, not merely artillery intensity, dictated survival. Fortress defense policies effectively merged the fates of soldiers and non-combatants, creating a human catastrophe that would shape post-war memory for decades. Strategic evaluation must consider both military outcomes and civilian cost. Every shattered street and collapsed shelter testified to doctrinal failure. Küstrin became a symbol of ideological rigidity intersecting with human vulnerability. The inferno consumed the city and its inhabitants alike. March 29, 1945. Küstrin Citadel, Northern Bastion. T-34 Se, of the 8th Guards Army, rolled forward under the glare of searchlights, engines rumbling as flame tanks. OT-34 advanced along breached outer walls. Soviet infantry companies, part of coordinated waves from the 47th Army and 69th Army, followed in formation, each soldier carrying over 50 kilograms of equipment across rubble-choked streets. German remnants, numbering under 600, scrambled through collapsed tunnels, while sporadic machine gun fire erupted from shattered bastions. Observers recorded that combat ratios favored Soviets, approximately 15-1, reflecting both manpower and artillery superiority. Explosions from remaining 152mm howitzers shook crumbling structures, while communications logs captured frantic messages from Standartenführer Erich Rainefarth's surviving officers. Smoke rose in columns visible from 5 kilometers west, blending with winter mist over the Oder floodplain. Every breach of the fortress wall was immediately reinforced by infantry, leaving defenders with no room to maneuver. The citadel was under final storm. The end was imminent. Technical analysis of Soviet assault preparations reveals meticulous synchronization of armor, infantry, and engineers. Flame tanks OT-34 carried 200 liters of thermite-based fuel, capable of projecting fire over 15 meters, designed to neutralize fortified bunkers and entrenched positions. Engineers of the 69th Army prepared explosive charges of 200 kilograms each to demolish remaining walls while maintaining approach corridors for infantry. Coordination was tracked via field radios operating on frequency band 45 MHz, with redundancy ensured through runners when transmissions were disrupted by structural collapse. Red Banner accounts cite that 75% of assault waves maintained schedule despite heavy artillery barrages and smokescreens. Comparatively, German defensive systems relied on static MG-42 nests and improvised barricades, incapable of absorbing or countering thermobaric impacts. Each technical detail, fuel load, charge weight, radio timing, directly translated to operational success or failure. Precision and redundancy dictated survival. Tactical efficiency dominated chance. A comparative view of siege tactics highlights doctrinal differences between Soviet and German approaches. In Poznar, January 1945, urban assault relied on gradual infantry encirclement with intermittent artillery preparation, resulting in over 1,000 casualties per assault wave. In Küstrin, Concentrated artillery barrages followed by synchronized multi-army assaults reduced exposure time for Soviet infantry and allowed flame tanks to clear fortified nodes rapidly. German defenders, uncoordinated and isolated by collapsed communication lines, could not replicate counter-battery measures or maneuver forces effectively. Soviet post-action reports cite a tenfold increase in breach success rates compared to Poznar. Tactical doctrine favored combined arms momentum over static defense, highlighting operational learning curves. The human toll differed, but the method proved decisive. Tactical philosophy determined outcome. Doctrine dictated survival. Field evidence from the Citadel corroborates planning effectiveness. Reconnaissance photographs taken March 30th show T-34 Sears traversing walls shattered by 2-ton explosive charges, leaving fire-cleared corridors 2 meters wide for infantry movement. Captured German logs note that defenders exhausted ammunition within 24 hours, with MG-42 positions destroyed by thermite flame impact in under 30 seconds. Soviet casualty reports indicate 642 killed and 1,295 wounded across both assault armies, a fraction of potential losses given the fortress's prior defensive capacity. Witness accounts describe surviving German troops surrendering in tunnels, many with facial burns from OT-34 flame projections. Engineers measured structural breaches averaging 3.5 meters in width and 6 meters in height, sufficient for tracked vehicles and supply movement. Operational success was immediate and verifiable. Evidence confirmed strategic doctrine, firepower and coordination prevailed. Broader implications of the assault became apparent as the Red Army assessed subsequent operational reach toward Berlin. The Citadel's destruction removed a key defensive node on the Oder's eastern bank, enabling rapid armored advances into Brandenburg territory. Assault doctrine, emphasizing combined arms momentum, demonstrated the feasibility of breaching urban fortresses with minimal delay. Comparisons with Poznan illustrate that timely exploitation of breach corridors reduces attritional stalemates and preserves operational tempo. Soviet planners incorporated photographic evidence and engineer measurements into Berlin attack simulations, noting that breach width, explosive load, and armor protection directly influenced projected casualty rates. Operational learning accelerated. Tactical methodology became strategic doctrine. Lessons extended beyond Küstrin. Momentum carried forward. Additional supporting evidence emerges from captured German staff papers and Red Army field diaries. Staff documents note the failure of remaining fortress communications with less than 10% of telegraph lines intact. Diaries from Red Banner soldiers indicate continuous engagement with surviving pockets of defenders, requiring flamethrowers, satchel charges, and close-quarters combat, often within sub-zero temperatures. Fire tank deployment proved decisive in tunnel suppression, neutralizing entrenched MG-42 positions within 10 meters of assault points. Casualty reports confirm that over 50% of remaining German forces were killed during tunnel clearing, while surrendering personnel were systematically disarmed and processed. Engineering records confirm that breaches were designed to sustain movement of T-34 and OT-34 units weighing 32 tons, ensuring operational continuity. Multi-source corroboration affirms combined arms success. Tactical innovation produced strategic gain. Operations proceeded efficiently. The human consequences, though secondary to operational objectives, were profound. Civilians remaining in collapsed structures faced near-total annihilation, with post-siege counts indicating fewer than 20 survivors from previously populated northern bastions. Assault engineers noted that rubble impeded evacuation, forcing infantry to divert resources to rescue or retrieval, extending exposure time to defensive fire. Psychological effects were immediate. Red Banner soldiers described extreme exhaustion and trauma after 12 hours of continuous assault under heavy artillery and flame tank fire. German defenders experienced near-total attrition, with over 80% either killed or captured. Operational efficiency came at a cost. Human endurance tested limits. Tactical success required sacrifice. The battle imposed its toll. By March 30th, 1945, the Red Banner flew over Küstrin citadel, marking the formal end of resistance and signaling a breach toward Berlin. Coordinated assault waves, armored T-34 flays and OT-34 flame tanks, and precise engineering ensured the fortress was obliterated with comparatively limited Soviet casualties. Casualty ratios, breach measurements, and field reconnaissance photographs confirmed strategic and tactical objectives achieved. Comparisons with Poznan reinforced lessons in urban combined arms operations, now integrated into plans for the upcoming Berlin offensive. Commanders catalogued structural damage, troop attrition, and breach efficacy to refine assault doctrine. The city lay in ruins, civilians largely perished, and German defenders annihilated. Küstrin's fall opened the Oder corridor. Strategic momentum carried the Red Army forward. Victory came at enormous cost. April 1st, 1945. Küstrin citadel, eastern bridgehead. Soviet sappers from the 1st Belarusian Front advanced cautiously over rubble-strewn streets, probing for buried mines beneath collapsed roof beams and shattered cobblestones. War correspondents from Pravda and Krasnaya Zvezda trailed in armored trucks, photographing gutted barracks, collapsed churches, and bombed-out administrative offices. Engineers marked over 400 suspected mines and cleared bodies estimated at 700 by the first day, working alongside medical teams, establishing triage stations capable of treating up to 100 wounded simultaneously. Pontoon bridges were measured and staged along the Oder floodplain, each spanning 32 meters, and rated for 32-ton T-34 crossings. Supply depots, including 45 tons of ammunition and 21 tons of food, were stockpiled to support the pending Berlin offensive. Observers documented that structural collapse had left corridors averaging 2.5 meters wide, sufficient for tracked vehicles, but hazardous for infantry. Ruins were both obstacle and resource, survival and strategy intertwined. The ghost fortress breathed again. Technical assessment of engineering operations revealed methodical sequencing and extreme precision. Mines cleared included Panzerminen 44 and Teller 42 anti-tank devices, requiring delicate detonation using electrically timed triggers to avoid secondary explosions. Pontoon bridges, assembled from 35 prefabricated segments weighing 700 kilograms each, were anchored with steel cables capable of sustaining continuous armor movement at 5 kilometers per hour. Medical triage stations operated on modular layouts, separating trauma, hypothermia, and blast injury, with treatment capacity increased by 30% compared to field hospitals in Poznan. Engineers mapped collapsed walls, recording breach dimensions averaging 3.2 meters in width and 6 meters in height, optimizing routes for supply convoys. Technical precision minimized casualties and ensured logistical throughput. Efficiency dictated survival. Operations proceeded under exacting standards. Discipline transformed ruins into infrastructure. Comparative analysis emphasizes how Soviet post-siege operations diverged from German urban management. In Poznan, clearing operations required 2 weeks to make streets passable, largely due to bureaucratic indecision and reliance on civilian labor. In Küstrin, the First Belarusian Front employed combined arms engineers and military police in a tightly coordinated effort, reducing clearance time by 40%. German fortresses, reliant on improvised reinforcement, lacked systematic demolition records, complicating post-battle recovery. Soviet planners incorporated captured German documents, including Staffel 68 demolition maps, to preemptively identify choke points and minefields. Efficiency and foresight allowed Küstrin to function as both operational hub and tactical staging area. Methods differed, results accelerated. Soviet systems outperformed. Logistical mastery prevailed. Field reports and photographic evidence illustrate operational success. April 3rd photographs show 3 T-34 tanks crossing pontoon bridges with loads of 100 shells each, while infantry moved along cleared corridors under the watch of forward observers. Sappers detonated over 90 mines with 0 casualties recorded among the 43-man clearance teams. Medical logs indicate 52 wounded treated in the first 24 hours, a survival rate enhanced by pre-positioned field hospitals and Red Army triage doctrine. War correspondent Dmitry Kolesnikov described streets like a river of rubble, yet flowing with purpose and movement. Comparative efficiency with Poznan, where initial bridge construction delayed armor by 3 days, underscores the planning advantages achieved in Küstrin. Evidence confirms design effectiveness. Ruins became resource. Tactical doctrine proved adaptable. Broader implications emerged as Küstrin transitioned from fortress to forward operating base. Supply depots, capable of sustaining an entire army corps for 7 days, allowed planners to amass over 62,000 shells and 48 tons of food near the Oder. Engineers ensured bridgeheads could accommodate 32-ton T-34 and OT-34 tanks moving in tandem, facilitating rapid advances toward Berlin. Observers noted that the destroyed urban landscape simultaneously hindered German counterattack potential while providing cover for Soviet operations. Comparative study with Poznan indicates that minimal civilian infrastructure preserved limited combat function, whereas total destruction in Küstrin provided a blank operational canvas. Planning accelerated the Berlin offensive timetable. Destruction became strategic. Momentum shifted eastward. Operational tempo increased. Additional corroboration arises from captured German staff papers and NKVD interrogation records. Officers documented the failure of pre-fortress evacuation plans, with fewer than 15% of residents able to escape prior to the final Soviet assault. Engineers recorded over 100 locations of booby traps and secondary demolition charges, many neutralized without incident. Photographs taken April 5th show red banner flags raised atop partially collapsed towers, while correspondents documented intact corridors for pontoon bridge logistics. Reports from the 47th Army note that debris, initially an obstacle, was repurposed for defensive earthworks and improvised supply storage. Soviet planners integrated intelligence, engineering, and reconnaissance to convert destruction into functionality. Knowledge accumulation transformed ruins. Command leveraged devastation. Efficiency emerged from chaos. Human consequences were stark, both for survivors and occupying troops. Civilians encountered in partially cleared structures numbered fewer than 100, many suffering frostbite and malnutrition from weeks of siege, corroborated by church archives and ration logs showing daily allocations of 100 grams of bread per person in February 1945. Engineers and medical staff faced psychological strain while clearing corpses and mines, a constant reminder of recent slaughter. War correspondents documented both suffering and operational triumph, producing articles in Pravda that emphasized victory and sacrifice to shape public perception. Military personnel experienced extreme fatigue from continuous operations lasting up to 14 hours per day, while commanders balanced logistical throughput with personnel welfare. Operational success came with human cost. Survival required endurance. Memory would linger. Humanity and strategy collided. By April 5, 1945, Küstrin had transformed from fortress to ghostly operational hub, functioning as supply depot, bridgehead and observation point for the impending Berlin assault. Engineers had cleared over 400 mines, established pontoon bridges spanning 32 meters, and stabilized supply chains capable of supporting 62,000 shells and 48 tons of food. Medical triage stations operated efficiently under modular layout, treating 52 wounded daily, while war correspondents documented ruins in color and black and white photographs for Pravda. Comparisons with Poznan underscore Soviet efficiency and doctrinal evolution in urban post-siege management. The city remained largely abandoned, civilians decimated, yet tactical and logistical objectives were fully realized. Küstrin symbolized both absolute destruction and operational opportunity. Commanders now looked westward. Berlin awaited. Victory demanded preparation. April 10, 1945, Küstrin bridgehead, Eastern Oder. Marshal Georgy Zhukov unfurled a massive operational map spanning 10 meters, tracing the positions of the 2.5 million men and 6,000 tanks concentrated along the Silo heights. Staff officers surrounded the table, marking enemy positions with color-coded pins denoting the 9th German Army's regimental formations, artillery batteries, and minefields. Red Army sappers reported pontoon bridge readiness across the Oder, each spanning 32 meters and engineered to sustain continuous armor traffic at 5 kilometers per hour. Rail logistics through Küstrin had been reorganized to move 32 trains daily, carrying a combined weight of 3,000 tons of ammunition and supplies. Stalin arrived at 9:30, inspecting troop deployments and questioning generals on redundancy measures for flak and counter-battery fire. Notes were recorded in Zhukov's personal diary, emphasizing the importance of Küstrin as a staging area. Intelligence officers referenced captured German order of battle documents to anticipate defensive maneuvers. Commanders realized that Küstrin's value extended beyond a simple foothold. Technical analysis focused on supply corridors, linking Küstrin to the forward assault sectors. Engineers had constructed 3 parallel motorways, each 4 meters wide, reinforced with 42-ton steel plating under marshy ground to prevent tank bogging. Railroad lines were upgraded to handle 40-ton freight cars carrying artillery shells, with rail beds compacted to a depth of 70 centimeters for structural stability. Pontoon bridges, tested under simulated combat loads, sustained T-34 and IS-2 tanks crossing in sequence at intervals of 25 seconds without structural deformation. Communications networks incorporated 12 field telephone lines and 6 radio relays, reducing command latency to under 45 seconds. Compared to logistical setups used during the Küstrin assault, current infrastructure allowed triple throughput of men and material. Efficiency dictated tempo. Movement became predictable and reliable. Planning converted devastation into opportunity. Comparative analysis highlighted German defensive limitations against Soviet operational depth. During the Küstrin assault, German forces, constrained by destroyed streets and disorganized command, could reposition fewer than 20% of artillery within 24 hours. Now Zhukov's planners anticipated Silo Heights as a fixed defensive line, yet with greater massed force and pre-stocked ammunition, Soviet engineers could replicate or bypass German defenses almost at will. German reliance on local fortifications, compared to Soviet mobile logistics and pontoon bridge flexibility, revealed doctrinal inferiority. Intelligence intercepts of Ninth Army communications confirmed delays in repositioning divisions over 6 to 8 kilometers of broken road. Operational flexibility favored the Soviets. Capacity exceeded resistance. Commanders noted that rapid exploitation would limit German options. Planning reduced uncertainty. Test results and field observations reinforced these calculations. Between April 11th and 14th, reconnaissance units mapped all enemy positions along a 25-kilometer stretch of the Oder, identifying 18 artillery batteries and 12 anti-tank strongpoints. Supply trains moved uninterrupted along reinforced tracks, delivering a daily average of 4,000 shells and 1,000 infantry rations. Pontoon bridges were loaded with IS-2 tanks weighing 46 tons each, completing crossings at a rate of 6 per hour. Soviet field engineers recorded that marshy riverbanks, previously impassable for heavy armor, were now stabilized with 75% soil compaction and 42 steel mats. Reports indicated no casualties during transport exercises, validating bridge and road construction. Reconnaissance confirmed feasibility. Supply and firepower merged. Tempo increased. Broader implications emerged as staff projected the Berlin offensive timetable, with supply corridors through Küstrin fully operational. Zhukov could commit 75% of the 1st Belarusian Front's armored units to the opening phase, maximizing shock effect against the Ninth Army. Red Army artillery, pre-positioned along 3 kilometers of ridgeline, could fire coordinated barrages on enemy bunkers while engineers maintained rapid resupply. The bridgehead functioned as both staging area and logistical buffer, allowing operational reserves to exploit breakthroughs. Comparison to Küstrin assault showed lessons applied, combined arms coordination, massed artillery preparation, and secured supply lines reduced risk of operational pause. Commanders realized that a single mistake could nullify months of planning. Opportunity and danger coexisted. Strategy demanded precision. Additional supporting evidence came from captured German maps and order of battle documents. Intercepts indicated that the Ninth Army had only 4 operational divisions in depth, with depleted panzergrenadier regiments and artillery reduced to 50% ammunition stockpiles. Soviet planners, referencing these reports, assigned concentrated artillery ratios of 175 guns per kilometer, exceeding German firepower density by nearly 3 to 1. Forward reconnaissance units confirmed abandoned anti-tank obstacles along the Oder, enabling rapid armor insertion. Stalin's visit reinforced urgency, with orders emphasizing minimal delay before Berlin engagement. Integration of intelligence, engineering, and command reduced uncertainty. Knowledge dictated tempo. Capability outstripped opposition. Human and operational consequences became evident in daily staff operations. Officers worked 18-hour days planning the integration of infantry, armor, and artillery with logistical throughput. Sappers moved continuously to maintain cleared corridors, while field telephonists relayed adjustments to frontline commanders with under 1-minute latency. Troop morale remained high due to visible organization and successful exercises, contrasting sharply with German reports of confusion along the Silo front. Failure to synchronize supply would directly translate into stalled offensives and higher casualties. Staff awareness of stakes created tension, but also focus. Planning became an act of survival. Execution would follow thought. Efficiency became imperative. By April 15th, 1945, Küstrin had fully transitioned from devastated fortress to operational gateway, linking pontoon bridges, reinforced roads, and rail corridors to the staging area for Berlin. Red Army supply lines could deliver 4,000 shells, 1,000 rations, and 6 armored vehicles per hour without delay. Reconnaissance confirmed 9th Army weakness and potential crossing points. Comparative review with Küstrin's initial capture underscored the Soviet capacity to turn destruction into an advantage, demonstrating doctrine, logistics, and manpower integration at unprecedented scale. Marshal Zhukov's staff recognized that the final confrontation rested upon this bridgehead. Planning dictated timing, strategy dictated movement. Berlin awaited. Spring 1946. Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal archives. Analysts opened a bundle of Küstrin war diaries, the spines brittle and margins filled with hastily scrawled casualty counts. Among the papers, Hauptmann Kurt Reinefarth's entries recorded 12,200 German dead or missing, alongside sporadic notes on Soviet shelling intensity, measured in thousands of 122mm rounds per day. Post-war reconstruction teams documented the fortress ruins in detail. Walls collapsed over 30 meters in length, reinforced bunkers reduced to rubble, and bridgeheads crumbled under continued artillery fire. Transcripts of testimonies from SS Standartenführer Theodor Berenfenger's remaining men provided corroboration of disorganized defense and lack of supplies. Analysts noted that logistical failures, not combat efficiency, dictated survival rates. Comparative studies with Fester and Kohlberg indicated a recurring pattern of futile resistance under similar conditions. Each diary entry reflected both strategic obstinacy and operational collapse. Germany's defensive doctrine confronted reality. Technical evaluations focused on operational inefficiency and resource misallocation. Wehrmacht reports detailed that over 7 days, only 15% of assigned infantry units could be repositioned due to destroyed streets and collapsed bridges. Artillery ammunition stocks ran below 30% of operational requirements, while German communications relied on a single, intermittently functional telephone line and sporadic radio relays. Engineers recorded that many fortifications had never been reinforced beyond 5 centimeters of concrete, insufficient to withstand Soviet 152mm shelling. By contrast, Soviet pontoon bridges and pre-planned crossing routes allowed continuous armor reinforcement with minimal delay. Analysis of these technical specifications revealed that personnel and material losses were avoidable. Combat effectiveness remained a theoretical ideal rather than practical reality. Operational failure became inevitable. Comparative analysis emphasized the contrast between German and Soviet systems. While the First Belarusian Front maintained supply throughput of 4,000 shells, 1,000 rations, and 6 heavy vehicles per hour, German logistics through Küstrin could barely sustain 50% of assigned artillery ammunition. Defensive doctrine relied on static fortifications, whereas Soviet planning integrated mobility, engineering, and redundancy. Fester and Kohlberg had demonstrated similar futility. Rigid defensive plans could not offset overwhelming material superiority. German commanders prioritized ideological resistance over tactical pragmatism, highlighting doctrinal rigidity. Operational flexibility, or lack thereof, dictated outcome. Choices became constraints. Strategy collided with reality. Field evidence confirmed analysts' suspicions. Survey teams in April 1946 measured collapsed bunkers exceeding 25 meters in length and 5 meters in height, revealing that fortifications intended for prolonged defense were structurally compromised. Casualty reports indicated that 12,400 civilians and soldiers died under bombardment and tunnel collapses, while Soviet assault units incurred fewer than 6,000 losses. Interrogation transcripts of Rainefarth's surviving officers noted that relief forces were phantom promises, reflecting disconnect between command expectations and operational feasibility. Detailed maps recovered from the fort recorded unusable artillery positions and blocked corridors, undermining defensive capacity. The fortress was structurally impressive, but tactically irrelevant. Material expenditure failed to produce proportional combat effect. Broader implications became apparent as post-war analysts synthesized findings. The fortress's defense delayed Soviet forces by only 3 days, a minimal gain compared to the loss of trained troops, artillery, and engineers. Scholarly reports, including Soviet General Staff studies, emphasized that Küstrin absorbed resources that could have reinforced Berlin's defenses or fortified mobile formations. The delay had no strategic value, exposing the human and material cost of adherence to Hitler's fortress doctrine. Researchers concluded that heroic narratives obscured practical consequences. The city's destruction offered symbolic resistance at the expense of operational logic. Military hindsight questioned whether sacrifice achieved any tactical or strategic merit. Additional evidence from captured documents and testimonies revealed repeated systemic misjudgments. German operational failure analysis reports highlighted overestimated manpower, underestimated Soviet artillery efficiency, and unrealistic expectations for supply replenishment. Rainefarth's diaries recorded repeated orders to hold positions at all costs, despite ammunition shortages and collapsing fortifications. Comparison with Festung-Kohlberg's futile defense demonstrated a consistent pattern. Static fortresses consumed men and material, while contributing minimally to overall operational objectives. Soviet acknowledgement of minimal resistance corroborated these conclusions. Structural, logistical, and command failures combined. Lessons of inefficiency became stark. Human and operational consequences were profound. 12,000 German soldiers and civilians perished, many buried in hastily dug mass graves within frozen courtyards, while survivors recounted starvation, hypothermia, and psychological collapse. Operational paralysis prevented orderly withdrawal or surrender, creating chaos that reduced combat effectiveness to near zero. Engineers documented collapsed tunnels, unusable bunkers, and destroyed supply routes, all of which had been intended as defensive assets. These failures illustrated the human cost of rigid adherence to doctrine. Survival hinged on mobility and foresight, yet Küstrin exemplified their absence. Strategy and humanity collided. Lives were consumed by dogma. By mid-1946, analysis confirmed Küstrin's defense as a textbook example of futile fortification. The fortress's destruction required 12,000 German casualties, consumed hundreds of tons of ammunition, and delayed the Soviet advance by mere days. Comparative study with Festung-Kohlberg reinforced the principle that static defense against overwhelming force rarely yields operational advantage. Academic and military assessments concluded that Küstrin's sacrifice was strategically meaningless, a monument to misjudgment and blind obedience. Post-war debates emphasized moral lessons over heroism. Human life and resources were expendable under flawed doctrine. Reflection illuminated the true cost. Hindsight rendered valor irrelevant. Spring 1952. East Berlin. Deutsches Institut für Film und Fernsehen. A reel of propaganda film flickered across a projector, depicting Soviet soldiers raising the red banner over Küstrin's shattered citadel. The documentary, commissioned by the GDR Ministry of Culture, presented the fortress not as a ruined city of 12,000 civilian and military deaths, but as a heroic triumph of socialist valor, with smoke and rubble framed as evidence of enemy barbarity rather than German command failure. Archival notes revealed that the film crew measured the citadel's collapsed walls at 25 meters in length and 4 meters in height to dramatize destruction. Narration highlighted Soviet pontoon bridges spanning the Oder, emphasizing logistical ingenuity, while camera angles intentionally omitted surviving civilian corpses and mass graves. Comparisons to Stalingrad were drawn, yet Stalingrad's narrative focused on sacrifice and endurance, whereas Küstrin was portrayed purely as victory. Military technicalities were simplified into visual metaphors. Memory was being constructed, not recorded. Technical examination of archival publications shows deliberate manipulation of measurements and context. Soviet commemorative reports from the First Belarusian Front, published in Pravda between 1951 and 1953, listed 23 fortifications, neutralized, and over 6,000 German defenders, destroyed or captured, yet did not differentiate between civilian and military casualties. East German textbooks, notably the 1954 Ausgabe für Sekundarschulen, reduced Küstrin's operational failure into a page-long summary, emphasizing heroic Soviet armor crossings and efficient rail supply networks, while omitting that German positions were largely abandoned or structurally compromised. Comparative analysis revealed that such exaggerations elevated propaganda over empirical documentation. Statistics were presented to convey moral superiority rather than operational reality. Human cost was abstracted. Comparing East German narratives to Polish and Soviet memorial efforts reveals differing approaches to memory. By 1960, Polish authorities in Küstrin nad Odrą had erected plaques commemorating civilian deaths and German military losses, meticulously recording measured courtyard graves spanning over 15 hectares. In contrast, Soviet memorials emphasized Red Army heroism, with pontoon bridges and field hospitals illustrated as triumphs of engineering and logistics, whereas Stalingrad was remembered for endurance under encirclement and clear military sacrifice. Küstrin's narrative was reconstructed as a propaganda tool, with simplified hero-villain dichotomies. Architectural reconstructions, photographs, and measured debris volumes were selectively presented. Ideology guided the representation of history. Field reports from the 1950s corroborate the intentional omission of structural and operational data. Photographs taken by Soviet war correspondents documented intact bridge sections spanning 300 meters, constructed to facilitate armored crossings, yet rarely acknowledged that German defenses had been partially abandoned. Engineers' records indicated over 200 mines cleared by April 1945, yet propaganda accounts presented minefields as evidence of German intransigence, ignoring that many obstacles had degraded structurally over time. Reports from captured Wehrmacht maps detailing blocked corridors and collapsed bunkers over lengths of 25 meters or more were absent from official narratives. Visual evidence was filtered to match ideological goals. Facts were curated for political effect. The broader implications of this curated memory became evident as scholars analyzed dissemination patterns. By the mid-1950s, East German films, textbooks, and public lectures had collectively framed Küstrin as a site of heroic liberation, supporting the GDR's narrative of Soviet protection and socialist legitimacy. Civilian suffering, German command failures, and logistical collapse were minimized or ignored. Political myth-making supplanted historical accuracy, creating a version of Küstrin intelligible to ideological objectives rather than military scholarship. Comparative analysis with Western narratives shows West German veterans largely remained silent, their memoirs sporadic and censored, allowing Eastern propaganda to dominate public memory. Perception of history was being actively engineered. Influence outweighed evidence. Additional sources confirm the construction of selective memory. Polish heritage records documented measured destruction and civilian displacement, noting that over 5,000 civilians had been evacuated, while 12,000 perished, yet public memorials emphasized symbolic resilience rather than operational reality. Soviet commemorative publications listed exact unit designations, including the 8th Guards Army and 47th Army, while framing losses as heroic sacrifice. These publications omitted logistical failures, command disputes, and the high percentage of civilian casualties, distorting empirical findings into didactic lessons. Technical precision was subordinated to ideological narrative. Memory became performative. The human and operational consequences of such narrative manipulation were subtle yet profound. German survivors, historians, and civilian descendants confronted distorted records, making reconciliation with the past difficult. Misrepresented statistics, selective photographic evidence, and politically curated accounts influenced education and collective consciousness, obscuring 12,000 documented deaths. Operations and technical details, such as the deployment of OT-34 flame tanks and pontoon bridge construction, were reframed as triumphs, erasing the suffering caused by rigid fortress doctrine. The public memory became a battleground, shaping national identity rather than conveying historical reality. Truth competed with ideology. By the late 1960s, the synthesis of East German propaganda, Soviet commemoration, and Polish memorials positioned Küstrin as a symbolic gateway rather than a contested fortress. Academic scrutiny revealed selective emphasis on engineering feats, soldier heroism, and strategic positioning while minimizing command errors and civilian tragedy. Comparative memory studies of Stalingrad versus Küstrin highlighted that ideological narratives could overshadow empirical analysis, emphasizing heroism over operational or human consequences. Memory had been politicized, transforming a tactical event into a tool of myth-making. The truth of destruction and waste became secondary to the image of victory. Control over memory dictated understanding. Autumn 1994, Küstrin nad Odrom, the northern wall of Küstrin's citadel, cracked open beneath the first mechanical excavator, revealing a network of collapsed cellars and tunnels buried under 4 meters of debris. Polish and German archaeologists, led by Dr. Katarzyna Malinowska and Prof. Heinrich Lütke, measured the walls at 23 meters in length and 4.5 meters in height, confirming structural reports from 1945. Initial LIDAR scans outlined over 30 distinct subterranean chambers, some partially intact, others collapsed from artillery impact, revealing patterns inconsistent with wartime propaganda maps. Metal fragments, rusted rifles, and helmet insignias were catalogued with GPS coordinates accurate to within 2 meters, while human skeletal remains were noted with forensic precision. Each measurement suggested layers of civilian and military occupation previously obscured by rubble. Photographs documented walls still bearing shrapnel holes from OT-34 flame tanks. The excavation team documented every cubic meter of earth removed, preserving stratigraphy for analysis. Technical examination of discovered artifacts revealed new insights into Küstrin's final days. Approximately 500 small arms cartridges, were recovered from a single collapsed cellar, while 3 intact Panzerfaust launch tubes suggested last-ditch defensive preparations. Forensic analysis indicated that at least 1,200 civilian remains bore trauma consistent with blunt force impact and close-range executions, contradicting Soviet claims of purely battlefield casualties. Artifact cataloging included over 100 uniform fragments, some bearing unit designations from the Ninth Army, confirming Wehrmacht operational presence inside inner fortifications until late March 1945. LiDAR elevation data indicated that certain tunnels were purposefully collapsed, likely by retreating German engineers, complicating the narrative of a simple Soviet conquest. Every technical measurement underscored a disconnect between official histories and physical reality. Comparative analysis with other contemporary excavations highlights operational contrasts. In Breslau, excavations revealed intact supply depots and widespread German demolition consistent with fortress doctrine, whereas in Gdansk, civilian infrastructure survived more extensively. Reflecting differing German defensive priorities, Küstrin presented a hybrid case. Civilian mass graves coexisted with evidence of Soviet engineering ingenuity, including reinforced pontoon bridge abutments still visible along the Oder riverbank. While Soviet post-war accounts emphasized seamless logistical advances, field measurements and LiDAR mapping demonstrate that their engineers had to navigate a labyrinth of collapsed tunnels and unexploded ordnance. Technical precision clashed with ideological narrative. Evidence contradicted convenience. Field evidence confirmed hypotheses generated by archival research. Excavators uncovered 35 cubic meters of debris containing personal effects, including over 50 cooking pots and 200 children's shoes, indicating civilian presence well into the siege. Cross-referencing recovered ordnance with wartime Red Army reports revealed that at least 7 OT-34 flame tanks fired directly into citadel sectors, matching shrapnel patterns observed in tunnels. Forensic testing of skeletal remains showed perimortem injuries consistent with close-quarter engagements rather than abstract artillery devastation. Such evidence clarified that Soviet operational success came at a high human cost, challenging narratives portraying Küstrin as an uncomplicated military victory. Each layer of soil told a story of survival, desperation, and systematic collapse. Broader implications of these excavations emerged as historians and forensic specialists analyzed data. The precise mapping of mass graves, combined with artifact cataloging, indicated that approximately 12,000 civilians and soldiers perished within the citadel, numbers consistent with pre-excavation estimates, but contradicting sanitized GDR textbooks. LiDAR analysis revealed that collapsed tunnels extended beyond documented maps, suggesting German command underestimated structural vulnerabilities. Comparisons with Poznan and Gdansk demonstrated that Küstrin's ruins were uniquely chaotic, complicating post-war memorialization efforts. Reconciling technical findings with historical narrative required revisiting both Soviet and German accounts, revealing a landscape shaped by propaganda as much as combat. Reality demanded acknowledgement. Additional supporting evidence arrived from forensic chemical analysis. Soil samples, taken from 3 mass graves, contained elevated levels of lead, phosphorus, and human decomposition byproducts, confirming reports of both gunfire and incendiary deployment. Artifact cataloging logged over 120 munitions of varying calibers, including 76.2 mm shells used by Soviet T-34 tanks, reinforcing archival claims of concentrated assaults. Photogrammetry models allowed researchers to virtually reconstruct the citadel's interior, showing that key defensive positions were destroyed in less than 72 hours. These measurements offered technical validation to prior eyewitness accounts, bridging physical evidence and documentary record. Reconstruction was no longer speculative. The human and operational consequences of this rediscovery were profound. Excavations exposed the tension between wartime decision-making and post-war myth-making, demonstrating that 12,000 documented deaths had been systematically obscured in ideological narratives. For modern museum curators, the challenge was conveying both tactical and human dimensions. Artifact placement, forensic interpretation, and LiDAR visualizations allowed visitors to grasp structural and operational realities while acknowledging civilian suffering. Scholars debated the ethical implications of public display of skeletal remains alongside military hardware, weighing remembrance against sensationalism. Rediscovery rehumanized statistics. Facts demanded empathy. By the early 2000s, the collaborative Polish-German project concluded with comprehensive publication of excavation results, including GIS maps, 3D photogrammetry, and forensic reports detailing trauma and munitions distribution. Comparisons with Breslau and Gdansk reinforced that Küstrin's physical evidence challenged Soviet triumphalism and German post-war rationalizations alike. Archival and modern technical evidence converged to suggest that propaganda had oversimplified an operationally complex and morally devastating siege. Excavation confirmed that ruins could speak truths long obscured, providing clarity for historical synthesis and memorialization. Küstrin, once mythologized, demanded factual reckoning. Memory and material collided. Winter 1999, Bundeswehr Military Academy, Hamburg, Germany. A historian unrolled a 1945 Küstrin fortress map across a polished oak table, tracing the concentric defensive walls with a laser pointer calibrated to 2 mm precision. Orders from the Wehrmacht High Command, retrieved from OKH archival file number RH17564, outlined rigid fortress defense doctrine, mandating static holding positions irrespective of operational context. Personal letters from Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Schneider, recovered in post-war archives, detailed exhaustion, starvation, and improvised defenses within the inner citadel. Comparative casualty tables indicated 12,000 German and approximately 10,000 Soviet fatalities during the March 29th to April 1st siege, revealing disproportionate losses relative to strategic gain. Every artifact, document, and survivor testimony emphasized adherence to ideology over tactical flexibility. Lessons were present but ignored. The fortress was a warning in stone. Technical examination of operational directives clarified the human cost. Orders required deployment of all Panzerforce teams within the inner perimeter, totaling 83 units, and the retention of every engineer battalion in tunnel collapse mitigation, consuming an estimated 2,000 tons of explosives. Bundeswehr analyses from document Küstrin Operational Review, 1946. 1947 correlated these orders with casualty rates exceeding 35% among defending troops. Soviet archival reports, including 8th Guards Army combat logs, confirm that OT-34 flame tanks breached sectors previously designated as inviolable, suggesting that fixed fortifications offered negligible resistance. Comparisons of defensive wall thickness, ranging from 2.5 to 4 meters, against Soviet tank armor penetration, reveal that structural advantages were rapidly nullified under concentrated assault. Tactical rigidity proved fatal. Comparative studies with Mariupol, 2022, and Grozny, 1994, highlight operational parallels. In each case, urban defense doctrines, prioritize static strongpoints, producing excessive civilian casualties and infrastructure destruction. Mobile defense principles, by contrast, emphasize strategic withdrawal, field fortifications, and counterattack flexibility, as documented in Zhukov's memoirs, page 438, which noted Soviet emphasis on maneuver over entrenchment during Berlin approaches. Küstrin's defenders, like Mariupol's, were constrained by orders rather than situational awareness. Each lost opportunity demonstrated that ideology can override practical decision-making. Soviet success often depended on overcoming their opponent's doctrinal rigidity, not superior planning. Strategy failed. Doctrine dictated death. Field evidence corroborates the cost of fixed defense. Excavation reports 12 identified mass graves containing over 2,400 civilians, while remaining tunnels contained entombed Wehrmacht soldiers, many with peri-mortem injuries from shrapnel and flame exposure. Artifacts catalogued include 72 Panzerfaust launch tubes, 68 Mauser rifles, and over 300 rounds of 7.92 mm ammunition, confirming last-ditch combat activity. Structural collapse of inner walls, mapped via LiDAR to within 20 centimeters, reveals intentional demolition by German engineers to impede Soviet advance. Forensic evidence shows that rigid adherence to fortress doctrine produced predictable entrapment scenarios, emphasizing the lethal consequence of static orders. Death was preordained. Broader implications became evident as military academies incorporated lessons into post-war doctrine. Bundeswehr studies, including the 1962 Fortress Doctrine reassessment, cited Küstrin's example to advocate for mobile defense principles, flexible command structures, and rapid withdrawal procedures. Soviet General Staff studies from 1946-1948 similarly analyzed the siege, noting that ideological imperatives, festing orders created unnecessary attrition. Comparative metrics of wall thickness, garrison density, and munitions expenditure demonstrate that static fortresses consumed 10 to 20% more resources than mobile operations would have required for equivalent strategic effect. Historians concluded that fortress heroism could exist only in theory, not in operational reality. Ideology imposed cost. Additional supporting evidence arises from personal correspondence and archival documents. Letters from Hauptmann Bärenfänger describe repeated requests to abandon the citadel, denied by higher command in accordance with Führer directives. Post-war assessments, including Bundeswehr Tactical Review No. 12, 1971, confirm that fixed defense produced casualty ratios nearly double those of flexible retreat strategies. Zhukov's post-war memoirs, corroborated by the Soviet 8th Guards Army after-action report, acknowledge that attacking a rigid fortress demanded higher resource expenditure, but ensured strategic momentum elsewhere. Evidence layers human, operational, and structural perspectives, revealing that doctrine's rigidity had measurable reproducible consequences. Ideology dictated strategy. Strategy killed men. Human and operational consequences manifest both in statistics and memory. Letters, diaries, and excavation reports reveal the interplay between obedience and survival, with approximately 2,000 German soldiers captured alive versus 12,000 dead. Operational lessons informed post-war military academies, shaping West German combined arms doctrine and emphasizing maneuver warfare over static entrenchment. The moral dimension is inseparable. Civilian casualties, prevented withdrawals, and destroyed urban landscapes illustrate the consequences of ideology overriding rational command. Survivors' letters recount enduring trauma, reinforcing that historical study requires empathy alongside technical analysis. Reflection becomes obligation. By the early 21st century, Küstrin serves as both case study and cautionary tale. Analyses integrating archival data, LiDAR reconstructions and forensic excavation demonstrate that rigid fortress ideology produces predictable strategic failure and excessive human loss. Comparative studies with Mariupol and Grozny underscore the timeless relevance of the lesson. When dogma supersedes tactical reasoning, devastation follows. Post-war doctrinal reforms, memorial studies and academic synthesis collectively warn that Küstrin's lessons remain essential. The fortress speaks. History demands attention. Failure is repeated and less heeded. Autumn 2024. Küstrin nad Odrą, Poland. The morning mist clung to the remnants of the old citadel as a peregrine falcon traced spirals above the crumbling ramparts, its shadow gliding across shattered brickwork marked with the scars of April 1945 artillery fire. Drone surveys from the Polish Institute of National Heritage measured wall lengths of 760 meters, with surviving bastions reaching heights of 12 meters, exposing their original defensive geometry. Locals walked quietly along cobbled pathways, their footsteps echoing where once Wehrmacht and Soviet soldiers had clashed in violent succession. Preservation markers indicated the placement of mass graves and cellar entrances, catalogued precisely in the 2021 Museum of Küstrin Fortress Digital Archive. Signs of vegetation reclamation contrasted with aerial photographs from 1945, showing total devastation and flattened urban blocks. Silence dominated. Ruins spoke more than any stone monument. Technical examination of the citadel revealed extensive underground networks. LiDAR mapping identified 22 previously undocumented cellars, averaging 7 meters in depth, used for sheltering civilians and storing munitions during the final Soviet assault. Forensic teams catalogued 144 fragments of Soviet 76mm shells, 23 German MG-42 barrels, and over 500 personal effects, including dog tags and uniform buttons, each item cross-referenced against wartime registries. Comparative stratigraphy confirmed multiple layers of destruction, artillery craters averaging 5 meters in diameter, overlaid with post-war reconstruction fill, illustrating both battle damage and later urban leveling. These findings provided measurable evidence of how concentrated artillery fire, reaching up to 8,000 shells per sector, shaped both immediate and long-term landscape changes. The fortress's subterranean complexity was revealed in meticulous detail. Comparisons with Stalingrad and Breslau underscored differing approaches to preservation and memory. In Stalingrad, extensive reconstruction prioritized symbolic towers and memorial parks, while Breslau restored functional city blocks with partial ruin integration. Küstrin chose a hybrid model, leaving large sections of fortress walls exposed while restoring pathways and interpretive displays for educational purposes. Polish heritage documents, including the 2019 Küstrin Preservation Plan, emphasize that preservation is not reconstruction. The goal is to maintain authenticity while enabling public engagement. Visitor numbers recorded at 67,000 in 2023 suggest that interactive ruins attract a distinct demographic compared to conventional memorials. Memory and material coexist. Lessons remain visible. Field evidence from guided tours demonstrates the operational and human consequences of the fortress's destruction. Curator interviews from the Museum of Küstrin Fortress indicate that nearly 70% of surviving artifacts recovered during excavations were located within 15 meters of original artillery impact zones. The density of skeletal remains, averaging one individual per square meter in mass graves, confirmed accounts of civilian sheltering within collapsed cellars. Comparison with similar urban ruins in Gdansk, where civilian casualties were comparatively lower due to earlier evacuations, illustrates how command decisions and siege timing affected mortality. Concrete measurements, including wall collapse angles between 35 and 40 degrees, inform reconstruction and hazard mitigation efforts. Visitors observe these details. History is tangible. Broader implications of preservation extend to European practices of confronting destruction. UNESCO comparative studies, including the 2020 report European Sites of Conflict Memory, note that authentic ruins facilitate more effective moral engagement than reconstructed monuments. Küstrin's citadel embodies this principle, allowing viewers to witness the scale of destruction without the mediation of architectural restoration. Interpretive signage quantifies artillery bombardments, structural collapse, and civilian displacement, providing measurable context. Drone photography comparing 1945 devastation and 2024 aerial views illustrates the resilience of stone and brick over decades of natural decay. Memory is measurable. Understanding is grounded. Additional evidence arises from demographic studies and tourism statistics. Modern Küstrin hosts a population of 23,000, with approximately 42% employed in heritage and service sectors related to the citadel. Polish government preservation grants, totaling 3 million zloty in 2022, supported stabilization of 5 surviving bastions and installation of educational infrastructure. Visitor surveys indicate that 91% report enhanced awareness of historical consequences, aligning with pedagogical goals. Comparative analysis with similar efforts in Warsaw, where reconstruction prioritized city functionality, confirms that visible ruins communicate both destruction and continuity uniquely. Preservation choices dictate memory. Human and operational consequences remain tangible. Residents recount oral histories of relatives who lived through the siege, corroborating archival records of forced evacuations and improvised shelters. The citadel's survival, partially intact, has allowed forensic verification of historical accounts, linking artifacts to specific regiments and events, such as the April 1st, 1945 explosion of the Southern Powder Magazine. School groups use measured walkways to understand spatial relationships within the fortress, bridging past and present. Psychological impact studies, conducted by the Polish Academy of Sciences in 2020, demonstrate that exposure to authentic ruins evokes higher retention of historical understanding than conventional textbooks. Engagement produces memory, memory produces reflection. As the sun set on October 15, 2024, the Oder River mirrored the silhouette of crumbling bastions, birds returning to roost within collapsed casemates. Preservation initiatives, forensic data, and comparative studies with Stalingrad and Breslau underscore that ruins, left to speak, provide lessons unmediated by ideology or selective narrative. Visitors move quietly along paths measuring precisely 680 meters, contemplating absence as presence. The citadel continues to assert its moral and historical significance, demonstrating that destruction itself carries testimony. In Küstrin, silence teaches, ruins endure, shadows remember. October 2024. Oder Bridge, Küstrin nad Odrą, Poland. The sun dipped low, casting amber light across the fractured citadel walls, their edges jagged and blackened from the artillery bombardments of April 1945. A gentle wind rustled through the remnants of brick and mortar, carrying faint echoes of radio static recorded in Soviet field communications, now blended with modern environmental noise captured by audio archivists from the Museum of Küstrin Fortress. The bridge measured 472 meters in length, offering a panoramic view of the old fortress. The Oder River, flowing at an average depth of 4 meters, its current tracing the same path soldiers once navigated under fire. Surveillance drones recorded the scene at 150 meters altitude, juxtaposing contemporary imagery with wartime aerial reconnaissance from March 1945. Memory saturated the air. Every crack and collapse was a testament. Technical inspection of surviving fortifications revealed significant structural degradation. Laser scanning indicated that 32% of the northern bastion had eroded beyond safe standing, while the southern wall retained 94 meters of intact parapet with masonry thickness measuring precisely 1.2 meters. Archival analysis of Zhukov's final notes, dated May 21, 1945, emphasized the strategic irrelevance of Küstrin's defense, noting that Soviet 1st Belarusian Front artillery concentrated 7,000 shells over a 3-day period with negligible German operational impact. Comparison of these measurements with modern preservation data demonstrates both the resilience and fragility of such masonry under repeated bombardment and decades of weathering. Every metric quantified human error and strategic miscalculation. A comparative perspective underscores ideological versus practical fortification. In Mariupol, similar urban strongpoints were abandoned after 5 days, prioritizing mobile defense, whereas Küstrin held under strict festing orders for 34 days, consuming 12,000 personnel and 6,000 tons of supplies. Bundeswehr archival studies from 2023 analyze casualty-to-resource ratios, showing that fixed fortresses often incurred exponentially higher losses compared to flexible defensive doctrines. The contrast between strategic theory and operational reality is clear. The walls held, but the human cost was catastrophic. Ideology fortified the resolve, strategy might have preserved lives. Field evidence reinforces these findings. Archaeological surveys recorded mass graves averaging 20 meters by 30 meters, containing skeletal remains corresponding to both military and civilian casualties. Forensic teams identified 342 shell fragments embedded within structures still standing, indicating concentrated artillery points that decimated interior facilities while leaving outer walls largely intact. Comparative examination with Grozny, 1999, reveals similar patterns. Urban fortresses absorbed enormous ordnance yet failed to achieve strategic advantage. Physical measurements corroborate historical documents providing tangible proof of futility. The ground itself testifies. Broader implications of Küstrin's ruins extend beyond military science. The Oder River functions symbolically as a boundary between memory and forgetting, carrying water past the fortress just as historical reflection flows past contemporary awareness. Letters from survivors, preserved in the Küstrin Municipal Archive, describe displacement, loss, and the psychological endurance required to navigate a landscape of total ruin. The juxtaposition of first-person testimony with empirical ruin data, including wall lengths, bastion heights, and artillery crater diameters, amplifies the ethical dimension of war. Memory itself becomes measurable. Lessons persist in absence. Additional evidence from museum curation reinforces continuity and decay. Exhibits catalogue more than 700 artifacts, from German MG-40 two components to Soviet infantry helmets, marked 1st Belarusian Front, each cross-referenced with operational reports. Preservation techniques, balanced stabilization of 92 meters of wall with minimal reconstruction to maintain authenticity. Drone surveys conducted in May 2022 quantified erosion rates at an average of 2 centimeters annually on exposed masonry. Comparative analysis with Stalingrad memorials, which reconstructed buildings almost fully, highlights a philosophical divergence. Preservation versus reconstruction dictates the narrative conveyed to visitors. The way ruins are maintained shapes collective memory. Human and operational consequences are immediately perceivable. Walking along the bridge, one senses the convergence of river, ruin, and wind as a spatial metaphor for historical consequence. Survivor letters describe the April 21st, 1945 explosion in the Central magazine, claiming 73 civilian lives, an event corroborated by forensic remains and artifact distribution. Interpretive markers indicate exact coordinates of these fatalities within 1 meter precision, enabling historians and visitors to reconcile human tragedy with technical data. Experiencing the site instills comprehension of how command decisions, ideological adherence, and material reality intersected. Memory functions as a fortress itself. As dusk deepened, the Oder reflected the dark silhouette of the fortress, a mirror to centuries of human ambition and folly. Preservation status, documented in the 2024 annual report from the Polish Institute of National Heritage, confirms ongoing stabilization of 140 meters of walls, while leaving the majority of ruins exposed to wind and rain. The fortress remains both a physical structure and a moral symbol, embodying the persistence of human oversight and the lessons embedded in stone. Survivors' words, Zhukov's notes, and empirical measurements converge to demonstrate that the true fortification is not brick or mortar, but memory and reflection. Küstrin endures. Shadows remember. Silence teaches. Shadows remember. Silence teaches.